We didn't. He had seen their army gathering. Or was that ghost? We won't retreat, Jon said again. The wall is mine, and the watch as well. It was not the first time he had said those words. Others came drifting back. I am the sword in the darkness. I am the watcher on the walls. I am the fire that burns against the cold, the light that brings the dawn, the horn that wakes the sleepers, the shield that guards the realms of men. Daenerys only looked at him sadly. The wall is gone, Jon. Some days he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling and seeing it not, lost instead in the great white world beyond with his wolf, hunting and running and tasting the bone, and marrow, and flesh, and blood between his teeth. With those eyes he saw terrible, nameless things. But was terror to a wolf? What was horror? Nothing, nothing at all. Mornings were harder. Endless words poured out over him, and 100 eyes turned to him, looking to see what he might do, searching for his answer. If they sensed something was amiss, Jon neither knew nor cared. Iron Emmett spoke to him about the state of their defenses, such as it was, and Dolorous said of their stores, and animals, and spearwives. Long Barrow was overrun with rats when they first moved in, and the spearwives had killed the nasty buggers, but now the place was overrun with spearwives, he said, and there were days he wanted the rats back. Most of their brothers did not share that sentiment. Jon saw more than one man bed down with the spearwives, Emmett among them, though they had shame enough to try to hide it from him. The soldiers had no such qualms. They had come here from as far away as the Riverlands and the Vale, thrown here from every corner of Westeros, disbelieving the nature of their true enemy no doubt, thinking that it was wildlings they would face, and defeat, and return home in time for the harvest. They had been sent to castles on the wall to man, and each had fallen, and now winter threatened to swallow them up. He had known some of them in another life, a past life, but if he had trusted them then, he did not trust them now. They all spoke of fleeing, the Lord of Riverrun and the young, boisterous lords that lingered around him, the Lord of the Vale who measured each word carefully, and the king most of all, who was above them all determined. The wall is lost, the words swirled around Jon like a storm, the wall is lost, the wall is lost. But that was about all they could agree on. Edmure Tully thought they should retreat all the way to the neck and hold the northern borders of his lands. Jon Arryn suggested the sea route as Tywin Lannister had done. But the king said Winterfell, as Daenerys did, and it began to take hold in the others' minds, like a prayer or a curse. His true brothers were not so easily convinced. Winterfell was 600 miles away, and the road no doubt stalked by blue-eyed shadows, and the storm so fierce now that a man would lose his way after a few steps. And what is Winterfell could not be held. Ed said that would be just their luck. Would they run all the way to Dorne, then? And what should happen when they ran out of land? They weren't all blessed with dragons, Ed said, they couldn't just fly off as they wished. Jon listened more than he spoke, and when he did, it was to repeat the same. If the wall fell, everything in the world would fall with it. Old words. He had said this before, argued this before. Was this hell, and he was doomed to wander the same path, evermore? The Dornishmen arrived from the castles they held on a day colder than the one before, their red and orange banners flapping wildly across the black sky. That same day, the king came to find him. Each time Jon saw him, it was as though it were for the first time. Sometimes he looked like a king for true, fair-spoken and fair-faced, and sure of every word, every action, every smile or frown. Often, he seemed like a boy, stumbling through the world, unsure and looking for the answer upon the lips of others. Other times Jon would look into his eyes, and feel in his heart that no one would ever truly know this man. Sometimes, he would move between all three, and that was how it was when he spoke to him, by turns halting and wary, others commanding and stubborn, entreating him to prepare himself and his men, to be ready for the long march. You may go if you wish. The men of the watch will remain here. And die, the king said. There is a reason the men have gathered here, Jon. The wall still stands, tottering and weak as it is. In other places it is gone, and all that remains are mounds on the ground. If we leave, we die. The king frowned. Not every man who sets out will survive the journey. But every man who remains here is certain to perish. They took vows. They knew the wall would be their life, and their death. And yours? Aegon asked. And mine. I am a man of the Night's Watch. You were not always that, Jon. Don't you remember? What of your mother? What of your cousins, what of our sister? You would stay here and die for nothing, rather than retreat and hope perhaps to see them again. I have already forgotten them. The memory of them was as dull as the taste of food in his mouth. He knew what he was eating by name, though not by taste. It was all the same, all tasteless, all grey. It was thus when thoughts of Winterfell and those in it came to his mind. He knew them, but not for true. They were as distant from his heart and soul as the grey castle of the Starks was from the wall. I don't remember. But Aegon only scoffed. Is this why you have come back from the dead? To die a second, final death for naught? Dead. 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 That night when he lay in bed, he said those words to himself. Dead. 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 He had died, but had he woken, or was he still wandering in that cold cave? In the dark of his room, Jon reached for the knife he had used to eat his dinner and took it to his wound, tearing off one by one each of the stitches that Daenerys had sewn for him. It hurt, but only a little, and when his hands were too wet and slippery with blood to hold on to the hilt, he used his nails, clawing away at his own flesh like a monster. Like a wolf. What would a creature such as him do among the living? Would any of them see him for what he was? A ghost, a monster, a beast. His wound was still bleeding when he rose in the morning, dressed himself and stepped out to where knights and squires had gathered, thick as flies, around heavy wagons laden with hides, chests of medicine, oil and torches and food, fodder and tents and other provisions. Emmett was leading a drill, but some of the brothers had stopped, and were watching the commotion. The wind carried the smell of their fear and anger. In the kennels, the dogs began to bay and growl. He looked up to the sky to search for dragons' wings. They were weak but growing stronger after hunting in the wilds, and they would protect the column on their journey south. Not my words. They belonged to someone else. Daenerys, perhaps, or Aegon. But there were no wings. There was only the wind, only the 100 scents that it carried, of man, and of wolf. It was a long moment before he understood. When he did, he ran past the soldiers, past their carts, too heavy by far, past his own brothers and the barking dogs, and to the space between Long Barrow and the wall itself, over broken stone and frozen dirt. Ghost. There he came, passing silently out of the void where he had remained for so long, the breath coming warm and white from his open jaws. Ghost. He shouted again, and the direwolf broke into a run. When he reached Jon he leapt, and they wrestled amidst the ruins of what had once been his rule. The direwolf licked Jon's face with a tongue like a wet rasp. When his eyes caught the light and shone like two great red suns, it came back to him, all of it, and it was so terrible that he felt the pain of it down into his bone, into his heart, into the very soul of him, where it would never be dislodged. Ghost, he said once more, and found that he was crying. Chapter 56, Robb 11. Chapter text. Robb stood in the crypts, staring at the statue of his father. Eddard Stark looked stern in death as he had not in life, at least, not to those who loved him, and who he loved in return. One day his own children or grandchildren would descend the steps and look upon this very same face, and wonder at who their grandfather had been. The thought that they would take him for a cold man, unknowable and undistinguishable from all those who had come before, was a painful one. And me, he wondered, what shall they make of me? My lord Sir Roderick had come to his side. Are you certain of this? Robb nodded. Yes. There was a time when the Master-at-Arms might have asked again, prodding him perhaps in another direction, but that time was past. I'll have all the swords gathered, even those that have rusted. Our iron stores are low enough as it is. Mikken will find some way to melt them down and reforge them. The man's look was grim, but he remained silent. Let the dead rest, he might have said, do not disturb them for the sake of crib tales. And he might have been right. But they had little enough obsidian between them, and save for dragon flame, the only other substance that might work against the others was iron, or so old Nan claimed. If years ago, he had known it would come to this, that he would follow the fables of an old, blind woman who had not left Winterfell's walls in decades, he might have laughed, or perhaps wept. For now, he only took the sword from his father's lap, and handed it to Sir Roderick by the hilt. The man took it gingerly. The swords were laid there for each who had been Lord of Winterfell to keep the vengeful spirits in their crypts. Was his father's soul free to wander the castle now? Or was it a world away, in the lands beyond the wall? As you say, Lord Stark. Robb left him, and climbed out to the surface. The wind that left him there was almost enough to knock him back in, and the snowflakes which swirled from the dark sky at dawn had become a hard sleet, forcing all to seek shelter inside. Winterfell felt strangely empty as he made him way up to the outer walls, where men bundled in furs and cloaks stood at their watch. He spoke to each of them for a few moments, and then looked northwards. The fog made for a bleak sight. He could see no further than the trenches and ditches they had laid down around the perimeter. It had been too long since he was up here. He had spent so long inside, crouched over papers, endlessly speaking, endlessly listening, or else in the yard with a sword in his hand, practicing against anyone with the time to stand before him until his shoulder ached and his body dripped with sweat. The snowdrifts were growing each day, piling 30 feet high in some places, and if it were not for the hot springs, they would be buried already. It would be a fearsome winter, even if it were not for the shadows that had come with it. Robb walked, until the cold got into his feet and snaked its way up, until he reached the southern walls. The air was clearer here, but only just, and if he looked close enough, he could even make out the King's Road. If he followed it, he would reach Sawin, and crossing the river would pass over the barrows until the swamps of Moat Cailin and the Neck met him. After that the ground would grow steadier, the grass greener as he passed through Tully lands, until he met the crossroads, where the forks of the river came together. It might as well have been Sotorios for all the good that it might do him. Of late, Rickon had taken to telling tall tales of all manner of things and people and creatures that he had dreamed up. Robb wished his brother was here now, and he might hear a story of how those in the south fared, of what the fishermen were doing on the Greenblood or the hunters of the Rainwood. It would have been nice to hear that it was still autumn there, that there were some people still who knew nothing of cold, or of what it carried in it. In truth, Robb knew too much to take comfort in that, but perhaps for a moment or two he could forget, until Arya called Rickon a liar, or Rickon became too lost in his own story. If he were a different man, he would have sent his children south months ago. He would have sent them to the Vale, perhaps, and the care of his Aunt Lysa, but the time was long past. His aunt and her court would have descended to the Gates of the Moon by now, which Lord Nestor had held since Lord Arryn journeyed north. They would be safe there, or at least, safer than here, but Robb had chosen his honor instead and kept them here so no man might say that Lord Stark was a craven, who would send him own children south in winter. Honor brought him little comfort. The wind rose as the sky grew darker. Somewhere in the maze of walls and courtyards behind him, the wolves had begun howling. The sound made him shiver. Snowflakes swirled around him, carrying in them pieces of grey ashes. Not rising from below, where the pyres had long since burned down, but falling from above. Robb looked up in time to see a pair of massive wings, visible only for a blink before they disappeared among the grey clouds, and a flash of red that could only be the fire behind a dragon's teeth. Robb stopped himself from running. He walked back the way he came, slowly, told every man of what he had seen and instructed the archers to keep their bows down. When he reached the northern gate, a crowd had already gathered to watch. For a while, nothing stirred and he wondered perhaps if he was mistaken, if he had seen only what he wanted to see, but the dragon circled back, graceful as a bird, despite its size, its tail swinging down so low it almost clipped the broken tower. All of Winterfell seemed to hold its breath then, even the most hardened among them, who had lived alongside the beasts at the wall and saw them nearly burn Castle Black to embers. The fog melted away against the black wings, like a great curtain being pulled aside, unveiling behind it a long line of men, as small as ants, trudging slowly through the snow. The bronze dragon came up from the rear, and exchanged places with the black, weaving slowly, almost lazily, above the front of the line and then dipping down once it reached Winterfell's walls and landing in the Godswood behind Robb. "Open the gates," he called down to Harwin. The call was repeated, and chains rattled as the portcullis was drawn upward, and the great gates opened to the creak of iron hinges. By the time Robb descended, the first of the men had begun to cross into Winterfell's walls. Whoever they had been before the war, knights or squires, or farmers or butchers, they all shared that same hollow-eyed look as all the others. On their feet they wore bare paws to better cross over the snow, but some men had strapped them around their ankles awkwardly and were already falling to the ground around him. Veon Poole knew well what to do, without waiting for the command. Those who could walk were led into the great hall, and those who could not were carried, to be warmed and fed and have their wounds tended to by Maer Stillowin and Samwell Tarly. High atop the world on his dragon, the king did not seem to have suffered the same ailments as the others. Aegon Targaryen emerged from the Godswood with not so much as a limp. By the time he reached Robb, others had come spilling out of Winterfell, taking the stairs up the walls, crowding in the courtyards for a peek at the dragon. All bowed before their king. Robb rose quickly, and looked into his purple eyes, rimmed with circles just as dark. Lord Stark. The king took off his gloves and pushed his hair back from his face. It was shorn short, dirty and stringy. Your Grace. Aegon looked across the yard. I feared by the time we arrived, we would find Winterfell already fallen. Our walls are stronger than that. There were 100 questions on his tongue, but it was unwise to linger long in conversation with this man. Your Grace must be in need of rest. My steward can take you to your rooms, and see to it that a warm bath, and a warm meal, awaits you. The king nodded, his eyes just past Robb, searching the faces of those who had gathered to watch. Have him bring my Kingsguard to me as well. There is much we must speak of. Only Sir Jaime Lannister and Sir Oswell Went have survived, Robb said, more bluntly than he intended. The shock was writ on Aegon's face for a moment, and then smoothed away. Prince Luwin perished on the journey to Winterfell, and Sir Barristan and Sir Arthur in the battles that followed. Sir Franklin fell outside Last Hearth. Oh. The king's eyes were back on him. And Gale. Did the Wilderling girl bring her? Yes, was all Robb could bring himself to say on that. The king seemed relieved. Thank the gods. Daenerys be here soon, you'll have seen her dragon perhaps. Robb nodded, and began to make his excuses. A moment, before you go. It was a command, not a request. You ought to know before the others. The Lord Commander remains at the wall, and his men are with him. We counseled him otherwise, but in the end, his voice trailed off. Robb felt horror, but not surprise. The wall was a crumbling ruin, each letter that had come from the keeps that guarded it was a plea for help, or explanation of retreat. It would not fall, it was as good as fallen already. And Jon would be there until the end. Robb wondered if he would have made the same choice, and realized he already had. I see. He has his dragon and his wolf. All the same, Aegon's look was almost sheepish, if such a thing could be said of kings. Someone ought to tell his mother, perhaps. He spoke as though Jon was already dead, and was tasking some other poor soul with the burden of delivering the news. Perhaps he had, and that poor soul was Robb. Yes, Your Grace. The Kingsguard found their king quickly after that, and disappeared into the inner keep together, leaving Robb to see to the armies that had been brought to his gates. His uncle Edmure was among them, his beard and hair grown so bushy he might have been mistaken for a Northman, and the Blackfish, who had lost 2 fingers to frostbite. The Valyman themselves carried in Jon Arryn, grievously ill. Among the Dornishmen he saw Prince Oberyn, but only at a distance, before he too went into the inner keep. The last to come were the Wildlings, and his own wife, crossing Winterfell atop her dragon only when the gates were closed at last. It was past midnight by then. Robb left a command with Jory that each of the Spearwives was to lay down their weapons if they were to take shelter here, and walked to the Godswood. Snow was falling heavily, and melting when it touched the ground, leaving the air humid, and misting. Day and night Northmen had taken to praying before the Heart Tree, but the new arrivals had drawn them away, and all that remained were the muddy trails their boots had made. Daenerys was at the end of one such trail, near a pool of warm mud that stank of rotten eggs. And fire. Behind the sentinel trees, he saw glimpses of dragon scales. She sensed him only when he was at her side, and a faint smile brushed her lips. He touched her cheek. Robb Daenerys' breath steamed between them. Her smile faded. Is she? Yes, she's safe. A sob escaped from his wife's lips. Quickly, she brought her hand to her mouth to muffle it, and the tears that threatened to fall stayed brimming in her eyes, as though she had willed it. I was frightened to come, she managed to say. She's safe, Robb repeated. So is Cregan. You'll be so proud when you see them. His wife put her hand on his, squeezed it, and pulled it away. I'll go to them. Thank you. Robb might have asked, For what? But she was gone too quickly, and he was alone with her dragons. One of them was watching him, its massive molten eye tracking his movements. Slowly, he backed away. Dragons did not eat human flesh, unless the dragon lords of old had erased such crimes from the Maestas tomes, but some brave fool might venture to the godswood for a peek at the beasts, or stumble upon them as he went to pray, and who could say what they might do then? He would not keep the men from praying to their gods, but he would have guards set out to warn those who did. Winterfell did not sleep anymore, and neither did he. Every corridor was filled with chatter, or whispers, and every hall and room with men and women and children, each begging a moment of his time, asking for information he did not have or could not give, or else seeking to curry favor with the Lord of Winterfell who stood between their life and their death. It was thus now, as it was every day, and by the time he reached his rooms, his wife was already there. Daenerys had bathed, and her hair was brushed and loose, wetting the top of her shift. At her chest, Alara slept. Cregan was asleep too, laid out beside her, but with his little hands, he clung to his mother's arm. Robb threw off his cloak, unlaced his boots, and sat on the edge of the bed, close to where Daenerys' feet were stretched out. They were bruised, stained black and blue, and 2 of the nails had broken clean off. "I'll go fetch Maester Lewyn." Daenerys shook her head. "It doesn't hurt. Come, sit with me." Robb did as she said, and took their son into his lap. When they were last together in Winterfell, Cregan was still in his cradle, and now he could run, and talk, and shout, and in a year perhaps he might ride his first pony. In a year. Robb kissed the top of his head, but it was Daenerys who his son longed for now. Sleeping still, Cregan pulled away, and held on to his mother's arm once more. "I want to see Munda in the morning," Daenerys said, looking down at their daughter. "I must do something for her, but I can hardly think of something she might want, or what would be repayment for all she's done." Robb bristled at the memory. "She has been repaid already. Jon has granted lands in the gift to her father and their people." His wife said nothing to that, which meant she had known. Robb did not wish to tread this path now. "The maids told me her name is Alara." He looked down at his daughter, eyes rimmed with silver eyelashes, so light that they looked white, and the tuft of hair on her head growing thick already, the same color. Robb wished he could sleep as soundly as she did. "It isn't the name you chose for her, I know," he said, softly, and felt so tired, so sick of it all. "And I would have honored it, if it were any other name. But she's not a Targaryen princess, despite her look. I won't have men wonder at the blood that runs through her veins and the seed that formed her." Daenerys looked at their daughter too. "I chose that name because we were all alone in the world. I wanted something for my own. But she's not yours alone. She's mine too." "I know that," she said, color rising to her face. "And she belongs to Winterfell." "She." Cregan was stirring, mumbling slightly in his sleep, a frown forming on his face. Robb knew the look well. If he woke now, it would be in tears, and it would be hours before he would sleep again. "What I did for love of her," Robb said, quietly, more gently. "And love of you. It was to protect you both." His wife said nothing. "Tell me, Daenerys. Please. Tell me how she came into the world." The thought of that had played on the edge of his dreams and nightmares since his daughter was brought to him. She seemed to shiver, and a dark look passed over her face. "No." It came out as a whisper. "Someday perhaps, but not tonight. Let us speak of something else. Tell me more of our children. Tell me of all the things they have done, and learned, and all of the sweet memories you have made together." Robb tried his best. When at last Daenerys fell asleep, he took their daughter from her arms and lay her down in her cushioned basket, and closed his eyes. He dreamt of nothing, and woke up once to hear his son's voice, whispering something, and a second time when morning had come, and his wife gently roused him. For a moment, still in that half-formed space between waking and sleep, it was as though he were half a boy again, and newlywed, long before anything terrible had happened. The boy's clothing she had arrived in and the mud-splattered boots were gone, and in their place she wore a dress of black velvet, trimmed with white, her silver-gold hair brushed over her shoulder. But she was thinner now than she had been then, her face so pale, and the illusion faded. Robb sat up, eyes thick with sleep. "Is it late?" "No, the sun only just rose. You should try to sleep." He swung his legs over the side of the bed. There's too much to do. I need to see how Jon Arryn is faring and speak with my uncles. Robb pulled on his breeches and his doublet, and sat down on the edge of the bed. But first, I must know you learned beyond the wall. And so, she did, with the manner of a battle commander reporting. She told him of their efforts to find the enemy at the source, and destroy it, only to retreat to the wall. She told him of the state of it, and of the watch, and its lord commander, and in the midst of all she had told him that was strange, and frightening, that was the worst of all, plucked straight from a nightmare. You must tell no one. I won't. But perhaps you were mistaken. You didn't look at him closely. If an infection had taken hold, it might have seemed like he was dead, only he wasn't. Only he was, she insisted. I saw his wound. I saw his heart in his chest and the cut through it where the blade entered. Robb's throat felt dry. So you mean to tell me a living corpse commands the wall? No, Daenerys said, quickly. He's not that. He's still Jon, and he's stronger now that his wolf has returned. We tried to bring him with us, Aegon and I spoke to him for hours. But he said he would guard the wall to the last man, even if that man was him. Her purple eyes were on his. What of your wolf, Robb? I haven't seen Grey Wind. Robb wanted to shrink under her gaze. He wanted to become so small that he could slip out of the world entirely, and take with him all memory of who he had been, and his grief, and the hole that was in his soul. His wife's voice was soft. She touched his hand. You don't have to say it, it's all right. He could not, even if he tried to. When they began to dig out the fallen whites from beneath the snow and stack their bodies in the pyres, they had found so many things. Weapons, some forged by skilled smiths, some crudely made beyond the wall. They had found the corpses of children, and women, and animals of all sorts, and even Dorne, but they had not found Grey Wind, so they may burn his body and bury the ashes in the Lycoyard. It filled Robb with a grief too deep for words. Daenerys snaked her arm across his back, and Robb let himself lean into her touch. He would have closed his eyes, and tried to be still, just for a moment, but a loud knock came at the door, and Fat Tom's voice behind it. My lord, Lord Tully begs urgent audience. Robb sighed. Take him to my solar, I'll be a moment longer, he called out. Begrudgingly, he sat up, for a final time. Sorry, he said, I must go, and plunged into duty, miserable and thankless. Edmure Tully did not invade Robb's solar with the Riverlords, and for that he was grateful. He came only with the Blackfish, both wearing a look so grim that his heart began to race, and his mind to wonder what other tragedy had been brought down on their heads. But it was an old misfortune that Lord Tully wanted to speak of the war already brewing in the south, and the riots staining his lands red with blood. Cat told me there is fighting already in the Dornish marches, he said, miserable. The refugees are fleeing to my lands, and the Westermen are pushing them back at the Gold Road. She says the Blackwater Rush is choked with corpses. Have you seen Princess Rhaenys' letter? Edmure nodded. She sent half the castle guard to my borders. But most of Riverrun's garrison is here with me. What are a few hundred men against the armies of Mace Tyrell? His mouth twisted in a frown. If war is coming, my lords will want to go home and defend their lands. I do not hold you as prisoner, uncle. But I do need your swords. War may come to your lands, but it is already here, at my gates, and the enemy we face is far more fearsome than the Lord of Highgarden. Robb had wondered how the Riverlords would take the news when it reached them, and now he would learn. You will not make it a league outside Winterfell, nephew, the Blackfish said, bluntly. Edmure shifted in his chair. With the dragons we might. Daenerys will not leave Winterfell. The king will. His uncle looked between them both. The High Septon himself declared Tyrell an enemy. Aegon may march again. The Blackfish scoffed, will, or may, or should. These words don't mean much in a war. Has he said as much to you? Edmure was only slightly deflated. No. He has been with his Kingsguard since he arrived, standing vigil for Aemon Targaryen. But surely, he will seek a path south. Nothing would have pleased Robb more than for Aegon Targaryen to depart Winterfell and never return, but not now, not when it would mean taking his dragon with him, and no doubt thousands of his men, all to die for a cause that would not matter when the others swept over Westeros. Has the Prince Doran declared war on Highgarden? The Blackfish asked Rob. No. Or, if he has, word has not reached Winterfell. The Blackfish seemed to weigh that for a moment. Then, he swept across the books and bits of parchment on the table to uncover the map below. With his finger, he traced the lines that marked the Red Mountains. Doran Martell is a cautious, careful man. The Dornish attack from here, in small numbers, and melt back into the passes and hidden valleys which they know best. To the north, the Westermen hold the borders with the Reach. To the west he pointed again, Aegon has won away allies from Tyrell, among them the Florents, Blackbars, Beesburys, Oakhurts, and further west the Mulladors, Peaks, Cuis, and Hightower, most of all. To the east, Dorne holds hard to King's Landing, and in the marshes no doubt the prince has forces hidden, and ready to descend. It is a noose, closing around Highgarden. All because Aegon broke his word, and his betrothal. Edmure shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I don't doubt you know Warcraft better than I, uncle. But I do know Aegon. He will not risk King's Landing to be taken, no matter how slim the odds. Brynden Blackfish shrugged, and if it is taken, what then? Lord Mace is no kingmaker. There is no one he wishes to deposit in that throne more than a Targaryen with a dragon, with Margaery Tyrell as his queen. He works now to bring Aegon to his knees, so he has no other choice but to make peace. And if he does not, there will be war again, and not one such as this, fought in the shadows, but one with death enough to rival the burning of Harrenhal, and the dragon's wrath. That was, if enough living men stood still to fight it, commanded by lords and princes and not warped and accursed by the White Walkers. A throne would mean little then, a king even less, when they were all ruled by the cold. Do what you wish, Uncle Rob said. Perhaps your men will survive the march and reach their homes. But if Winterfell falls, the others will follow you there. The Lord of Riverrun excused himself soon afterwards, promising he would think on it, and the Blackfish escorted Rob to the covered bridge. From here, they could see the courtyard, choked with people, and beyond it the armory, where sounds of Mikken hammering away at his forge rung out almost day and night. His wife was in the sky once more, flying just north of Winterfell on her black dragon. You have too many mouths here, Brynden Blackfish said, bluntly. Yes. It weighed on Rob, too. I had no choice. They would have died, and we would have had to fight them as whites. And now it is too late. Sawin is the closest castle, but it can't sustain more than its number. The journey over the Sheep's Head Hills to Hornwood is treacherous, and Torrens Square might serve if some boats were to meet us there, and ferry them further south. Brynden Blackfish nodded, and none will come. Rob sighed. The old men have been leaving slowly. At night, they asked for the gates to be opened so they may go hunting, and they never return. And your master-at-arms trains girls. I saw them from my window. It takes years to make a warrior. They won't be able to do much for you. I know, he admitted. But perhaps they can protect themselves, if it comes to that. If it comes to that, the Blackfish repeated. It will be too late. What is the state of your stores? Rob did not lie. Poor and growing worse. My father has set aside enough for 8 years of winter, but that was before the Ironborn attacked, and before he marched on the wall. And then the winter town fell, and all the refugees and the soldiers have come here, and the dragons, he remembered suddenly. We have half that now perhaps, if we ration carefully. And the wildlings. Please, let's not speak of the wildlings. His head was beginning to hurt. Brynden Blackfish arched a bushy grey eyebrow. What shall we speak of instead? The tower where strange lights and sounds have rung out all night. He motioned to the Maester's turret, away in the distance, and the top level where blue, and grey, and white danced even now, pouring out from behind the shutters and heavy curtains where Marwyn the Midge and Rob's brother Bran were encamped. It had been long since Rob had felt a fear as keen as he did the night when Summer ran out of the great hall, where he had been beneath the tables, sniffing out scraps. It had taken him too long to rise, deep in talk with the Great Yon, his senses dulled now that Grey Wind was gone. And so, it was little Rickon who had followed the wolf, and screamed out for Jory, and Sir Roderick, and their father. Half of Winterfell followed those cries and, at the end of them, found the Grand Maester, nursing his bleeding arm where Summer had bit him, and Bran, nervous and shy, holding back his wolf. Rob had the man taken to his solar, where Marwyn the Midge cleaned and dressed his wound himself, and answered his questions through teeth gritted in pain. He needed to speak to Bran, and in secret, but he was always with his wolf, or else, surrounded by nosy ears, who had no understanding or need for sorcery, who would mock and scorn and push the boy further inwards, where he would be no use to anyone. Bran must learn, and Marwyn to learn from him, and when Rob asked what, the man had led him to the room in the Maesters' turret, where a single, black candle burned. Bran is taking his lessons was all he said. Brynden Blackfish watched him a moment, and said no more. It was past time Rob went to look in on his brother. Alone, he threaded the path to the tower, and up the familiar steps he had walked 1,000 times before. He had not loved the rookery and the Maesters' turret as a boy. The ravens frightened him, and their cages smelled, and he had feared that the tottering piles of books and rows of stoppered jars that lined Maester Luwin's shelves would one day fall on him, and bury him. But his siblings had liked the ravens, and the mess, and did not worry as much as he had, for when their father and mother would sit them down afterwards, and ask after what they had learned. Like all young boys, he had thought his lessons endless, and useless, but now he felt he had learned too little, and it was too late to know all that he needed. He was nearing the Maester's chambers when he heard loud voices, and opened the door to find his aunt, red-faced and furious, standing before the king. It was unsettling to find Aegon Targaryen here, in the place where so much of Rob's life had passed. Maester Luwin's things were pushed to one side, the table at the center of the room cleared, and the king's guard in the white cloaks stood at either side of their king. What is the meaning of this? Perhaps you may tell me, the king said, his face strangely blank. He was seated, before him a quill and parchment. Rob looked to his aunt, but it was Sir Oswell who spoke, his expression shielded by his held. Lady Lyanna entered the room, without the king's permission, and has named him a murderer. I would hear it from my aunt, sir. She had fire in her eyes, and on her tongue. It was aimed at the king. You stand before the Lord of Winterfell, who has given you shelter from winter in his halls. The least you may offer as a repayment is the truth. Where is my son? Aegon turned to Rob. Jon is at the wall, he said, with the bite of annoyance. That is a lie. That is the truth, bitter as it is for you to swallow, Aegon Targaryen said. Jon remains at the wall with what remains of his black brothers. You are his brother, she spat. The wall has fallen, and anyone who has not come south is as good as dead. Those words are on every man's lips. Jon is not a fool, no matter what you might think. He would know. Aegon interrupted, that there is no hope. Yes. We told him as much. Perhaps you don't know your son as well as you think, my lady. Rob turned to his aunt. What he says is true. It pained him to say it, but this had gone on too long. Jon remains at Long Barrow. Daenerys told me the same. His aunt scoffed, and what she would have said next might have been cruel, and angered all in the room. But the grey light from the window suddenly darkened, and it seemed the candles lighting the room began to flicker. All fell quiet. It is the Black Dragon, returned Sir Jaime said quietly, to himself, to no one in particular. Rob and Aegon were at the window at the same time. There was nothing outside, but darkness. It was as though the tower had been carried to some island, surrounded on all sides by a black sea. When his eyes adjusted, Rob could make out torchlight, and campfires, and the outlines of the castle he called home. And then a flurry of white blew in, so cold and so fierce that he closed the shutters, and pulled the heavy tapestry over it. He was the only one who could hear what Aegon said next. That is no dragon. Chapter 57, Daenerys 15. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. On the seventh day, the children were gathered on the same level of the great keep so they may be guarded by fewer men, freeing more soldiers to protect the walls. Cregan was bewildered by it all, frowning to see his toys given to others, upset by the chaos of it all, grown used to being spoiled and undisturbed. Daenerys had tried to soothe him as best she could, telling him it would be like an adventure, but he was too young, or stubborn perhaps. He wanted for everything to go back as it was, he told her, and held on tightly to her knees. Rob's brother Rickon had no such fear. He was behind half the chaos in the room, leading a band of boys and girls in all sorts of invented games. His wolf bounded around after him, though Rickon had been told more than once to keep Shaggy Dog away. Daenerys did not have the heart to chide him. Playing as they were, laughing and chasing and challenging one another, it was hard to tell who was highborn and lowborn, who northerner and who wilderling, who hostage and who guest. It was hard to tell even that the only world they had ever known may be ending outside. What would they tell their children of this day, and their children's children? She wondered sadly how many of them would even live to have children. The infants were cared for in a room of their own, among them her own daughter, that miracle child who had crossed through winter. Alara, she had been named, but in her heart, Dany knew that was not her true name, no matter how often it was repeated. Her anger over what Robb had done, or let happen, had faded, but not her sadness. More than anything, it made her feel alone, that in the end nothing truly belonged to her, not even the children who she had borne in her body. Nothing perhaps, but her dragon. When it came to that, none might command her. Daenerys would never know what it was that passed through her dragon's mind, what he saw when he looked down from the clouds and saw the enemy. He seemed to know what to do without waiting for her command. His black fire would spit out, woven through with swirls of red, and even after all of this time, Daenerys would wonder whether a gust of wind might sweep upon them, and push his fire up towards her so she would be bathed in it too. It didn't frighten her. It would have been a relief, to die engulfed in fire, rather than to fall below, to be ripped apart by hands cold as ice and feel the grip of endless winter around her heart. The enemy they faced now was not like the monsters of before, unthinking and unfeeling, pulled along by strings to do the bidding of their masters. They were the others who had hunted them beyond the wall, who looked up at them with eyes that seemed to know all, and to hate. It was other sorts of servants they sent before them now, not the whites, but spiders as large as hounds. Daenerys remembered their icy webs in the lands far to the north, all washed away now, and they came again, here, moving so swiftly that she had not seen them at first, until the cold began rise and the wind shifted, and she knew beyond doubt that her enemy was here. She brought Shadow Tamer down low then, sweeping across the borders of the Wolf's Wood, its leaves all turned white, and there they were, moving as fast as the flurries of snow that they sent out before them. The first wave melted easily, and Aegon and Sea Flame had made quick work of the second once they were in the air with her, and afterwards they flew west, deeper into the wood and set their fires upwind. Acres of the Wolf's Wood were thus turned into a wall of fire, every tree a torch, and when they flew back to Winterfell that first day, it was with smoke in their faces, and the scent of burning wood scalding their nostrils. There were other things she saw that were not so familiar, neither easy to name nor easy to find. She flew half blind, eyes clouded by the smoke or the snow, and at times it seemed like a great shadow passed over her, as it had that first day she flew beyond Winterfell and saw the spiders in the woods. But each time she pulled her dragon upwards to search, she found nothing, and her and Shadow Tamer were alone in the sky. They had been in the sky every day since then, holding them back, Aegon flying in the night, Daenerys in the morning, never allowing them to reach further than a league outside the forest. Each day they grew in number, just as her dread that this was all but a glimpse of a beast that would sap their strength before it bared its true face. Each time that she returned to Winterfell, brought her dragon down in the Godswood and walked out into the courtyards, fearful stares met her. Dany would not have blamed them for that, but there was suspicion laced in it. It grew worse as her dragons grew hungrier, and they began to feed them the sheep they could spare from the folds, carefully managed and guarded until their arrival. Perhaps they thought it a waste, that it would go to beasts when not even the soldiers in Winterfell were served fresh meat each day. Or perhaps it was as Robb said, and it was because everyone was waiting, and did not know what for. From the walls, they could see nothing, save the fire and the smoke. Some of the children were playing monsters and maidens, except instead of a monster, a little wilderling boy no older than 6 was pretending to be a dragon, roaring and flapping his arms like wings to the delight of the girls he chased after. Cregan began to pull at her hand. "Dragon, Mama," with a chubby finger, he pointed at the door, "I want to go see." Dany knew which dragon he meant. When she had stopped in Winterfell on her way to the wall, she had taken her son on Shadow Tamer's back more than once. On her return, Cregan had not remembered her at first, not as his mother at least, but as the woman who flew the dragon. Since then, he asked after him every day. She knelt to better face him. "I'll take you to the dragon, but only for a moment, and only if you promise to be very brave afterwards and play like the other children." He bit his lip, his look serious, as though thinking it over, and nodded. Their walk to the Godswood was quiet. Sometimes her son would chatter on endlessly, about this and that, piecing together the words he knew to ask questions, or beg for stories, particularly in the evenings when she returned from her flight in time to put him to bed. Other times he would be quiet, sullen even, for no particular reason, preferring silence, and his own company, and it was in those moments that she recalled her dream, long ago, when he was first coming into the world, of the fierce man he would one day become. Winterfell's godswood was so old, and had grown undisturbed for so many centuries, that it swallowed up even her dragon, hiding all traces of him unless one climbed high up Winterfell's towers. But it was the acre with the warmest hot springs below the guest house that the dragons preferred, and the weight of their frequent landings had flattened down even the largest trees there which Robb had pulled away for firewood. It was there they found the dragons, curled up like lazy snakes around a murky green pond. The presence of the bronze dragon meant that Aegon had arrived. Usually he would wait for her, and tell her of what he had seen before he returned to the castle, but she had been late. Steam rose from the water and from the dragons' mouths and massive nostrils, and the air was thick with a green muddy stink and the scent of burnt flesh and fur. Seaflame moved his massive tail from the path to let them pass closer, but otherwise the dragons paid them little mind, long used to her and indifferent perhaps to the child she brought with her. Daenerys took her son's hand then. "Look." He pointed at the broken, blackened bones, cracked open for their marrow strewn on the ground. "They've just had their breakfast." At the sound of her voice, Shadow Tamer turned his massive head to face them. Her son took a step back. "It's all right to be frightened," she said, gently, squeezing his hand. "But you mustn't let him see." Daenerys lifted him and balanced him on his hip as they walked closer, and when they reached the black dragon, with her free hand she scratched the tough, warm scales on his snout. "Look who's come to visit you." It seemed almost as though he understood, his molten eye flickering to Cregan and then away again before closing. "You're lazy." Her son giggled at that. "Go on, you can touch him," Dany told him. Mimicking her movements, her son stretched out his little hand, and pressed it against the dragon's scales. "Hot. We fly now, Mama." She shook her head. "Not today. Some other time, perhaps. Tomorrow." A voice came from behind the trees. "No, not tomorrow either." Her husband had come, dressed in boiled leather and ringmail, looking so much as stark, stern and strong and cold as all his ancestors that had walked this godswood before him. Cregan pulled himself from her grasp and ran to his father, and when Robb smiled and scooped him into his arms, for a moment he was the boy she married. But that boy had been a stranger to her, as much as the man he had become. Once, she had dreamed of a husband with a gentle heart and a fair face. Robb had both, but it was all buried away now, behind years of war. "And my heart," Dany wondered, as she turned her back to her dragon and went to her husband, "what has become of it?" Some days it felt as raw and bloody as Jon's, beating on despite the wound, seeping blood with every pump, but somehow her body still moved and with words her mouth still spoke. "I've been searching for you," he said, in a quiet voice. Cregan's hands were wrapped around his neck, but their son's head was twisted to look back at the dragons. "I have ill news. Aemon Targaryen is dead." Her own grief surprised her. Her uncle had been many weeks in dying, and to hear Samwell Tarly speak of it, he had held on stubbornly only long enough that he might see the dragons, and their riders once more. But it was Rhaegar he asked for of late, and wept despite the answer, whether it was truth or merciful lie. Daenerys wrapped her arms around herself. "He was a good man. He was. They are building a pyre for him. If you wish to see him, you should go now." Many nights already she had passed holding Aemon's hand in that strange tower that bloomed with light where Brandon Stark and Marwyn the Midge worked secret things of which Robb had forbidden all talk. When she thought he could hear her, she would try to speak to him, of Dragonstone and King's Landing and places he would have known when he was a boy, and perhaps even loved. But nothing remained to him but his body now, and her own heart was too heavy to see the corpse of another she had loved. She shook her head, and to her surprise, Robb reached for her, and put his hand on her cheek. With gentleness he said, "It's a mercy. He died in his own bed, warm and cared for, and lived long enough to see his brother's great-grandchildren. He was the first to meet Cregan, when he was still in my belly," Dany remembered. Their son smiled at the mention of his name, as he often did, knowing that it was often followed by attention and embraces just as it was now. Robb pulled him closer, and kissed his forehead. "I'll take him back to the nursery. No, I'll go. She wanted a few moments longer with him, no matter how brief. Robb placed him on the ground, and Daenerys took her boy by his hand. Good luck today. Be careful, her husband said, and kissed her on the forehead as he had kissed their son. Daenerys raised her head, and kissed him on the lips. His beard had grown overlong, and it scratched her face, but she didn't mind it. You too. Outside the Godswood, and further away from the underground pools that melted the snow as soon as it touched the ground, Winterfell had become a labyrinth. The paths had turned into a maze of trenches. It shamed her that her son, young as he was, knew his way through these white walls better than she did. Before her wedding, she was made to study maps of Winterfell so she would not get lost and appear foolish in front of those who would one day call her their lady, but it had helped little once she had finally come, and every door and hall looked the same. Lady Catelyn had been her guide and her teacher then, in that and in many other things. And now it was her son who led her, until they reached the Great Keep. Cregan kept his promise, and returned to the nursery happily, racing off as soon as he crossed the threshold to see what Rickon and his band of followers had done in the meantime, and no doubt to boast of the dragon in the Godswood. Daenerys looked in on her daughter, sleeping still. The sight of her made pain bloom in her breasts, even though the milk in them had dried so many months ago. When Dany had chanced to seek out her daughter's savior in Winterfell, Munda had told her there were ways to bring back the milk, that if she held her daughter at her breast and let her suckle, it would return with time. Daenerys had tried one night, but she could not bring herself to do it for long. Her daughter had wailed and screamed in frustration and hunger. Of late, Daenerys had to learn about her children from others, and the midwife who cared for her daughter in her absence, a buxom woman from the winter town named Sara with 5 children of her own, had taught her the babe was easily roused, and hard to soothe back to sleep, and so Daenerys had resisted the urge to kiss her as she lay in her cradle and left, walking the same path again, as she had so often since her dragons were born, again and again in circles, until she was back where she began. Shadow Tamer was not so easy to rouse. He wanted to stay as he was, curled up with his brother, belly full and resting, and so for the first time in weeks Daenerys had to use her whip, earning herself a few thrashes of the tail and roars until at last, he acquiesced, and rose. When she first rode her dragon she had been half a girl, scared to look down and see how high up she had flown, but that fear was gone, as was what was left of her girlhood, and she watched as Winterfell faded away, until it was no more than a stone. It was a foul day, and snow was falling, heavy and ceaseless. Before her, the forest spread out as far as her eyes could see, still from this distance but all the while solid, harboring all sorts of nameless terror within it. Daenerys raised her whip in her hand and would have commanded her dragon to go to it, but that same shadow passed again, casting a darkness that was deeper than darkness over her. It was not a mere blink this time, not anything so brief and uncertain that it might be passed off as a trick of the light. She brought down her whip, and took Shadow Tamer up, past the clouds once more, up so high that even with a far eye, to someone on the ground they would have appeared no more than a fly upon the face of the winter sun. There, at last, she saw it. The beast was the size of Brytzen, but that was where the similarity ended. Its scales were an armor of ice, rippling and shifting in the faint light, and each time it beat its wings, snow swirled in the pale mists that followed it. It made no sound at all, that was the strangest thing. Daenerys could not hear its breath, she could not hear its great muscles stretching and straining as it kept itself afloat. There was nothing, only quiet. It sensed her, and turned to her with eyes that were not molten, but blue. Daenerys only had time enough to utter the command before the dragons were hurtling towards each other as rocks thrown from a sling. They locked together with such force, the chains around her waist pulling so tightly that she felt bile in her throat, and swallowed it back down. When Shadow Tamer clawed the flesh from the ice dragon's side, it came away like slush, like snow trod underfoot and turned soft as porridge, and then froze in the air and fell to the ground below like icicles. And it had claws of its own too, glittering, beautiful, horrible things, that tried once, twice to break through Shadow Tamer's thick scales and succeeded on the third, sending down a rain of black blood. Shadow Tamer's roar had been fierce then, full of pain and anger, and he twisted to snap at the beast. But they were tangled together like weeds, and together they fell, like all of the wind in the world had been sucked away, and there was nothing at all between them and the ground. She dropped her whip. All the way down, Daenerys pulled hard at the chains, wrapping them around her hands, and then her arms until she felt they would snap clean off. All the while the world swirled white and grey around her, and then only grey, 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 as Winterfell's towers rose up from the ground to meet her. She heard screams, though perhaps they were her own, and pulled once more with the strength that remained to her, and she was flying once more. Shadow Tamer tore his wings out of the grasp of ice, unfurled them across the world, and beat them enough times to pull them up and away, but only just. Spears and arrows rained around them, unleashed from Winterfell's walls, and they were falling once more. Dany had time enough to undo the chains around her waist and jump. If they had fallen within Winterfell's walls, they would have surely perished, but outside, the snow grew higher each day, untended. Daenerys gasped when she hit it, sinking in it as easily as water before hitting the hard layer of well-frozen snow. She clawed, digging her way out so it would not cave in and bury her, and above her cavern of snow she saw bronze wings in the sky. Aegon brought his dragon low, weaving circles in the air, until she emerged. Winterfell lay before her, the forest behind her, and her dragon was at her side. Daenerys went to him as quickly as she could, her heart in her throat, battling snow drifts as high as her waist, and when she reached him saw that he was whole, and no trace of the ice dragon remained. From Winterfell's battlements, the light of arrowheads dipped in flame glowed like 1,000 candles, and she wondered if one of them had found their mark. Aegon was in the air above her. "Go back!" she shouted. He had been in the sky all night, both dragon and rider were exhausted. Perhaps he might have listened to her, as he had of late, ever turning to her before making a choice as though he did not trust his own, but another shadow passed over the world and he was flying upwards to meet it. "Come on," Daenerys said to her dragon. The fall had knocked the wind out of her, and it took an effort to speak. Her wit was lost, her voice was weak, but her dragon did not wish to stay here in the open any more than she did. Daenerys mounted him and they flew, clumsily at first for he could now find purchase in the snow, and then they were treading the same path that they had taken, up into the dark clouds that were now as foreboding and full of terror as the wolf's wood. Sea Flame was faster than his brother, smaller and more agile, and his rider trained in warfare. He pulled the creature from the clouds, as though plucking a rose, but did not lock into it as Shadow Tamer had. Instead, he spat out a rapid stream of fire, and the ice dragon burst into water, though whether it was the same enemy as before or a new one, she could not tell. The wolf's wood had shielded all the beasts the others sent before them that crept on legs beneath the great white canopy where for centuries the Starks had hunted and hawked and their small folk carved out lives as crofters and foresters. It was hard to defend against it, harder still to do so with the fear in her heart that she was pushing back against a wave that would never end, but the sky, no matter how racked by storms, was hers. No longer. Daenerys had flown with Aegon more times than she had alone, and they each knew their role. He dipped below her and circled one half of the sky while she did the same the other, and when he saw what he saw, his dragon roared. Together they plunged towards their enemy. The biggest they faced were half the size of the one that had met her in sky, more wyverns than dragons, but all with flesh pale as milk and eyes that burned blue. Made of flesh, Dany would have thought them weak, little things, no more harmful than the ones of stone that had once decorated the walls of Dragonstone. But rendered in ice they were altogether different, altogether worse. "But they are still nothing," a strange, quiet voice inside her said. "They are nothing against the dragons, nothing against fire and blood." She thought of her son, going to the window and asking after the dragon, and wondered what he might see if he chanced to look up. It had been many months since the sun had appeared in the sky, unobstructed by clouds, since one might stand and lift their face upwards to let its warmth bathe him. Perhaps he would think it was only the sun, and all of Winterfell was there with him watching, and wondering. Daenerys only saw the fire. It was everywhere, coming out from their dragons' monstrous mouths like great clouds of flame, melting everything in their path, as though whatever it was that held the world together had splintered to rain down ash and smoke upon them. They were many, were Daenerys and Aegon were too, and they were quick and ferocious with beaks in place of snouts. If were allowed to draw near, they would engulf their dragons as ants do to their prey and pick them into pieces. But they were cleverer than that. It was the dragons' heads that they aimed for, and it mattered little how many were burned so long as one or two made it past the flame and succeeded in whatever dark deed drove them, tearing out her dragon's eyes perhaps, and sending them hurtling to the ground where the kill might be easier. Shadow Tamer burned too hot for that. Heat poured off him, his whole body steaming, and every wyverns who came close quickly melted, parts of them turning to water even as they flew and sloughing off until they could no longer hold themselves in the air and fell out of the sky as droplets. But Sea Flame had not rested, perhaps had not even fed, and one of the beasts came from below to rise up under its wing. Daenerys cried out, and Aegon unsheathed Dark Sister and struck out at the wyvern from his saddle. It died, like all the rest, but it had come too close, and others, even now, scrambled in the air to take its place. Quickly, Daenerys brought her dragon down below Sea Flame. As he beat his massive wings, a warm draft cut through the air and for a moment the wyvern's flight was unsettled, their attack slowed. A moment was enough for Aegon to bring his dragon around to cut through them with fire. Together, the princess and her king dove down through the clouds and to the canvas of white below, tainted only by Winterfell's grey, the wyverns at their tails. The dragons, for all of their size, were almost as graceful as dancers there, perfectly aligned, and it seemed to Daenerys that her and Aegon were too, that she knew his mind as well she her own. To the east, Winterfell grew larger once more, and if she had but the chance to look, Daenerys wondering if she might see the faces of those who stood protecting its walls. But it was then that she and Aegon drew their dragons back up, and Sea Flame twisted its neck to bait the creatures that had followed them, too slow to shift their flight upwards and pinned now between the dragons and the grounds. The rest met their end in a hail of arrows unleashed once more from Winterfell's defenders, and as the sound of cheers faded, another call was threaded through it. She could not hear the words, but she heard the panic, and when she flew her dragon higher once more to see, she saw what it was they feared. All their battles had been fought in the west in the shadow of the forest, but it was from the east that the enemy showed its true face. They came on horses, as cold and terrible as them, and sent before them hounds of ice to cross the expanse to Winterfell, and threw themselves against its walls. They moved with a quickness that Daenerys had not seen in man or beast, and for each arrow that found them, a second missed, until they were nearly upon the east gate. The world became red and black once more, as Shadow Tamer swooped down repeatedly to bathe their foes in flame. The hounds melted before the fiery fountains, but their masters did not fall so easily. It seemed to her through the smoke, and wind, and snow, that they were everywhere and nowhere, moving through the storm of their making as a shield, sending up flurries to blind her and Shadow Tamer both and melting away, only to rise again. When she first mounted her dragon, she could mark the passing hours of the day by the rise and fall of the sun. When the sun ceased shining, she could guess at what time it was by her own hunger and the pain in her thighs from being in the saddle over long. But that all fell away now. She only knew by how hot the chains that held her to her dragon grew that she had flown for longer than ever before without rest, knew too from the sight of Aegon, shouting something to her from his saddle, and that of his dragon, over-exhausted at last with the fire behind his teeth at last dimmed, that it had been more than mere hours. Aegon lingered too long, risking himself, risking his dragon, and hoping, she knew, that she would return with him and they might do as they had on Pike, and ride on the same dragon. But she would not turn back, and though he was long in accepting it, he did at last with no choice before him, and retreated. It was then for the first time that she let herself glance backwards and saw Sea Flame glide through the clouds towards Winterfell, and then the snow seemed to close up behind him, as though in leaving Aegon had taken with him the warmth that had helped to keep the storm at bay. And Daenerys was alone, and remembered her fear when she had journeyed to their lands and thought that there perhaps she might bring an end to it all, and instead found herself at the edge of the world, with blood between her thighs and pain ripping through her belly. Nothing would ever frighten her like that again, she told herself, not even this. Dany had thought herself lost then, and found a way all the same, and she was not lost now, though the cold pressed in from all sides and the others looked up at her from the ground, their blue eyes like 1,000 shining stars against the snow. If she wept now, she was sure the tears would freeze on her cheeks. Why would I cry? She asked herself. Shadow Tamer's fire was hungry, and it engulfed and consumed scores of them. Still, they stood and still he burned them, and she knew that this was not hell, not the loss of all hope, so long as warmth had not fled from her yet. If she was lost in their storm, she hoped they too were lost in her fire. Shadow Tamer's fire had never burned so hot, nor so long, and she called out command after command until her voice was hoarse and every word pained her to speak, but she shouted it out all the same, and each time she breathed in her dragon's smoke and felt it burn her lungs, it fed the fury that was growing in her belly. When she looked down, there were great rents opening in the earth where the snow had melted and boiled and began to cave it on itself. And as it did, it revealed all that the snow had hidden below. Corpses. The whites had besieged Winterfell when she was far away to the north, and Robb had dug out as many of them as he could to burn, but the snow had shielded more. They rose again. It was impossible to see clearly from so far above, and harder still to look out past the great mass of her dragon's body. Daenerys dipped down, and saw that her eyes had not mistaken her. They rose, men and women and children and all manner of beasts, grotesque and broken, and the heat began to gather in Shadowtamer's belly, hot enough to burn her boots where they lay against his scales. And then they were marching, and not towards Winterfell but away, east, to the enemy, and the others were raising their swords that were like shining crystals, and cut them down. But they did not die, no more than they had when men's hands had tried to do the same. They rose, and tried to rip the others from their saddles, and when their hands were cut away, threw their bodies against their horses. Dany cried out at the sight, and Shadowtamer took it for command, and unleashed his flame once more. Daenerys saw grass then, for the first time in a lifetime. It had been there all along, impossibly stubborn beneath the snow, and when everything melted, it had chanced to sway with the air once more. The sight of that piece of green put such hope in her heart that for a moment Dany saw the world as it was, no, as it should be, as Rhaegar promised it would be. Endless summer. Hills like a sea of green grass, spotted here and there with wild flowers, the air filled with sweet smells and the buzzing of bees and birds. But the north had always been a harsh land, even in summer. The grass froze once more beneath the others' footfalls, and then burned and died as Shadowtamer burned it, and all that was left of it was blackened, mudded earth. Daenerys was no battle commander, for all that Aegon would say to flatter her. Aegon the Conqueror, he had called her once, but that had been to suit his own ends, hadn't it? In truth, she could hardly tell if she was winning or losing, only that Shadowtamer was ever pushing forward. Or in circles, perhaps. The chains which held her to him had begun to burn through her clothes now, filling her nose with the smell of charred furs and leather, and the lands they flew over were already burned and boiling, like great, seeping blisters. Dimly, some part of her was reminded of the carvings in the halls of Dragonstone, of great krakens with their mouths open, eating everything in the ocean. Dragonstone. It had burned like this too, but there was nothing warm about the green fire that had engulfed it, not like this. Leagues away, more whites had risen, black dots as thin as small as pinpricks, growing larger as she flew closer and moving far too quickly. They were mounted, she realized, and too slowly came to understand what it was. She saw men, not whites. Men from Hornwood, perhaps, come to Winterfell's aid. In the midst of a great shadow they rode with screams and shouts of their tongues, and when Shadowtamer took her upwards to face it, she saw it was nothing as terrible as wyverns or ice dragons, but her silver beast, the one she had watched shed its stone and come to life, and the riders were not crying, but cheering. Bridesman roared her greeting, as Shadowtamer roared his, and spat out their flame together, until the only thing that remained in the world was fire. Notes. Thank you for sticking in here with me. I really hope you enjoy the chapter. I'm happy to answer any questions in the comments, and looking ahead, the next chapter will be a ground-level view of the battle from Winterfell, and I hope that will clear up some of what's happening here, as it's not so easy to keep track of the ebb and flow of battle when you're on Dragonback. We're almost at the end, and I want to thank you again for sticking with me on this very long journey. I know in many ways this story has been quite grim, and in some ways that's a function of the subject and the focus on the long night, but I think in retrospect it was also a reflection of a lot of things I was going through as I wrote this. All that to say, I know at times it hasn't been the easiest read, but strangely enough it's brought me a lot of happiness, and that's down to you all, so thank you, sincerely. Chapter 58, Robb 12. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Robb slept only an hour or two each day, and each time dreamt the same dream, of his wife falling through the sky, her hair whipping around her face, legs kicking, arms grasping at the air. He couldn't hear her, but he knew she was calling for him, asking for his help, but he did nothing, could do nothing, and when he opened his mouth to explain, she would hit the ground, and he would wake, his body covered in a sheen of sweat. It was a small mercy he did not wake with tears upon his cheeks, as some of the other men did. Some of his soldiers returned to their own beds at the end of each day's fighting, to their wives' embraces perhaps, and to their comfort, or else to the guards' hall, but many slept in the gatehouses, as he did. They cried out in their sleep sometimes, or woke from violent dreams dazed, but would break their fast in silence and go out to take their places once more, their weapons in hand. Some returned, but not all, especially in the first days when their foes came to Winterfell's walls on wings. They had prepared for many things, for the Whites to wake once more and throw themselves endlessly against Winterfell's walls, for the others to send bitter storms to break their spirits, and winds to shake the gates, for a long siege, when their rations would be stretched even thinner. But they had not foreseen enemies that came down on them from the clouds. Robb had been in the courtyard when dragons emerged from the clouds, ice and fire locked together in a terrible embrace, and made it up to the walls only to see them hurtling to the ground, and the archers raining arrows down on them. He shouted for them to stop, fearing one might pierce Daenerys in her saddle, but it was too late. The sky shone with 1,000 red stars shooting through the air and landing uselessly upon the snow, except for the one that found its mark in the ice dragon's eye. The creature did not wail, nor roar, but became water, and that water boiled and steamed against the heat of the black dragon. The dragon Daenerys had named Shadow Tamer had fallen alone then, too large and unwieldy to regain his balance once the foe that he had grappled with was gone, and a cry escaped Robb's throat when he knew Daenerys would fall with him. He did not see her jump from the saddle, saw only the dragon hit the snowy ground and roar out its anger, and then saw the other, the bronze one, with the king upon his back, circling, searching as Robb could not, ready to help Robb's wife as Robb could not. He had grabbed the fire from Fat Tom then, and desperately searched the ground, and felt his legs almost collapse from beneath him when he found the place where Daenerys had fallen through, and caught sight of her gloved hands searching for a way out. That was the last he saw of her for 7 days. Her dragon followed Aegons up to the clouds, and no living thing came down. In their place were creatures of ice without name, smaller than dragons but no less lethal, for they were quick and cunning. The air had filled with fire arrows then, hissing over his head each time he called out the command. Some of the wyverns crumbled, others made it close enough that they found purchase on the walls with their icy claws. A few men forgot their training then and slashed at them with useless, steel swords. The wyverns would dart out then with their beaks, and tear out their throat. Their obsidian spears were few, Valyrian steel ever fewer, and those who stood nearby battered at them with torches until one could come forward with such a weapon, and turn them to water. The wyverns were dangerous, but the panic they caused far more so. His father had taught him that discipline beats numbers 9 times of every 10, and each commander had shouted out, trying to bring their men back into form against an enemy they could not have imagined, even in nightmares. And the enemy was not endless, though it felt that way. They fought them through 2 nights and lost 100 men, Hayhead and Shad among them, but the walls stood and not one made it to the ground to sully Winterfell's earth. Robb gave the command then that the children, women, and those too old or sick to fight were to be moved into the cellars of the Great Keep, and tasked the Blackfish with posting men throughout Winterfell's yards and towers. That night, and for all the nights afterwards, there were great red clouds in the sky, shining a strange light over them, making shadows appear in the hollows of men's faces and beneath their brows, like skeletons with thin cloaks pulled tight over them. 1,000 years ago, when he was half a boy, hurtling towards King's Landing with little idea of what he would do when he got there, seeking justice for a wife he hardly knew and thought dead, and the Ironborn attacked his camp on Moat Cailin, he could taste his fear upon his tongue. It was sour, and filmy, and foul, and made it had to swallow, or to speak. During the battle on Pike, it was numbed, stuffed down beneath the bloodshed, and the corpses, and the screams of pain and cries of dead and dying men. It was much the same on the march from the wall to Winterfell, hounded by Whites and others, men dying around him each day, but the cold had been almost worse than the fear then, so brutal that it was all he could do to put one foot before the other, much less to stop and think. But he had his wolf then, and each day since Grey Wind died, he felt his fear rising, until he was as weak and scared as he had been in the neck. He had a duty to the tens of thousands of people within his walls, some he knew not at all, some only by sight, others by name, and a few so dear to him that to lose them would be to lose everything that was left of him, and then Winterfell would be nothing to him but a husk of a place he had once loved. It was clear in his mind that if Winterfell fell, all of the north would be lost, but now he had begun to see that the fate of Westeros would be decided here. The strength of the Riverlands, the Vale, Dorne, and the Crown Lands had gathered here, such as it was after all that has passed. It seemed to Robb that they fought as though they too knew that. On the 3rd day, news came to him that demanded he descend at last from the walls, to a Winterfell transformed. Long gone were the days when the serving girls would sit at the washing well, and giggle and blush when he walked by. There were no men drilling in the yards, no children playing their games and building snowmen. But it had been tended to, and no doubt it was his mother who had seen to that. The drifts of snow were piled up against the walls, but the doors behind them were cleared, the icicles had been knocked down from the battlements and towers, and steel shovels were used to break down the black ice that gripped the paths so they might be safe to walk. There was no one outside, save for the dogs and the direwolves and the soldiers the Blackfish had posted. He might have stopped to speak to them, if it were any other day, and ask for their names if he did not know them, but there was no time for that. Rob had rarely descended to Winterfell's dungeons. His father had cleared them when he had called his banners once more and marched on the wall, and since then they had been empty and unused. And Rob had made a mistake. Mance Rayder had been housed in a tower cell, and Rob had too late decided he should be moved to the dungeon, away from windows and the flying beasts which might fall upon them. Nothing was amiss as his cell was unlocked, and the once king beyond the wall placed in chains once more and marched down to the lower levels. But when they arrived to the dungeon, the gaolers were on the floor dead, with knives sticking out of their bellies, and two spearwives sprang out from the shadows. Porther was dead, and Jax badly injured, but in the end he and Jory had managed to disarm the women, and locked them in cells of their own. Sir Roderick greeted him outside the tower with a nod, his mouth a thin line. "How does Jax fare?" Sir Roderick looked worn down, and grey. "The wound is badly infected. They stole the knives from the kitchen and the blades were old and worn down. He will require all of Maester Lewin's skill." Rob cursed. "Has Mance Rayder been questioned?" "Yes, though little good that did. He says he knows nothing about a plan to release him." "Do you believe him?" "When we first put him to question, he laughed and asked what the use in escaping was, when there's nowhere to escape to. Turncloak and traitor he may be, but he doesn't strike me as a fool." Sir Roderick sighed, "but I can't say for certain. Men such as him lie as easily as they breathe." "And the women?" The master-at-arms spat on the ground. "Each word out of their mouth is a curse. They know their lives are forfeit and nothing can compel them to speak truth." Rob tried to think, through the exhaustion and the fear. He needed to be clear-headed, to push past the fog that was in his mind and everywhere around him. Perhaps it's as it seems. Perhaps they acted in alone, in fear, thinking their king would save them where the Lord of Winterfell could not. Or perhaps the treachery runs deeper than we think. We must be prepared for that. I've placed guards in the kitchen and the armory, and doubled those in the dungeons. Where are the other Wilderling women? In the cellars, as my lord commanded. We can fit them in the dungeons if they share 3 to a cell. He had already weighed that. No, Rob decided. Would that we could, but there will be bloodshed and chaos, and there's enough of that outside Winterfell's walls. Make sure they are well guarded and kept apart. I won't see anyone else hurt. Do the same for their children." Sir Roderick looked thoughtful. "It has always seemed to be that the one we should fear is the princess." "The princess? The sister of Mance Rayder's queen?" Rob tried to remember. Val. He could count on one hand the times he had seen the Wilderling princess, but he could not deny her beauty, or her air of nobility. Even so, something did not feel right. The princess had been living within Winterfell's walls for many moons now, and if it was bloodshed and revenge she hungered for, there had been better times for it, when their failure was all but guaranteed. Have her questioned, but not too harshly, and kept apart from the others, in the dungeon or her old tower cell, whichever you see fit. Shall I gather the others in the courtyard?" Sir Roderick asked, and they both knew what that meant. Rob nodded. He should have gone into the dungeons then. Perhaps it would be Jory who would meet him, grim-faced and silent. In his mind, torches lined the grey walls, but otherwise it was windowless, and from the proximity to the hot springs strangely warm, hot even. Guards stood before each cell, even those he knew were empty, their hands on the hilt of their sword, and when Rob would arrive at the one before which the ground was discoloured with blood, almost black in the torchlight, he would it was that which housed Mance Rayder. The king beyond the wall would forever be his shame and a blot upon his honour. The Wilderling king had sworn his vows to Rhaegar Targaryen and Eddard Stark, and exchanged his freedom in return for his life, and the lives of his people, but both men were dead now. And Jon. Rob felt sick to his stomach to think of it, even now. Jon was as good as dead already. Did that mean the vows he swore had died with him? Rob's steps led him instead to the God's Wood. There were many men praying beneath the great canopy of leaves, reclaiming their place of worship now that the dragons had gone. Even now he could smell their smoke. Some looked up from their prayer to greet him with a nod, but others knelt, their eyes closed, lips moving wordlessly. At the center of the grove, he knelt too, and tried to pray, as his father had taught him, but he was too weary, his heart too heavy. Instead, he studied the bark of the weirwood, white as bone, and its dark red leaves, and when he looked upon the melancholy, deep-cut eyes, he wondered if it was his brother Bran who looked, or the true gods. He closed his eyes. "Help me." Try as he could, the words would not come. He was beyond help now. When Rob rose, it was to a God's Wood transformed. The faithful at prayer were gone, the wood so silent that he could hear the rise and fall of his own breath. And he was being watched. Beneath the trees stood men, pale as morning mist. Some were bearded and long-haired, others fair-faced, some young, some old, but all looked at him with eyes that were cold and grey. "I am dreaming," Rob thought. "When I closed my eyes, I fell into a dream." When he looked closer, he could see some boar wounds on their ghostly bodies. One man had a knife sticking from his chest, another a deep gash across his neck, and worst of all was the one who was burned, his body a mass of blisters and weeping skin. Even so, they were fierce to behold. All except for one, the only lord to look at him with kind eyes and a sad smile. "Father." But with that word he was gone, all of them were gone, and the sounds of Winterfell returned to him. High atop the walls, the banners of Stark were twisting in the wind, somewhere the dire wolves were howling, and men were shouting out commands. Rob went to do his duty. In the courtyard outside the old keep, all had gathered, highborn and lowborn, northerners and wildlings, snow falling on their shoulders and all around them. Rob saw the Red Viper of Dawn and his uncle Edmure standing together, and Aegon's Kingsguard, in brilliant white. He saw Samwell Tarly, and Maester Stillowin, and his mother, Sansa at her side and Harry on Karstark not far off. And wildlings, nameless, no doubt nursing hatred and fear in their hearts. The block waited for him, and a woman, her hands bound, guarded on one side by Hwood, on the other by Harwin. Her clothes and face were drenched in blood, the blood of Winterfell's men, and when Rob went closer, he saw that it hid her youth. She was a girl in truth, not much older than him and skinnier even than Arya, holding herself still as a statue. No. He had it all wrong. She was no more a girl than he was a boy. She was a woman and murderer, who had killed his Golas, and Portner, and maybe Jax too, and would have killed Jory and the rest of them given the chance. And Rob had given her shelter and a place to pass the winter. He had let the wildlings eat at his own table, and they had repaid him in blood. When Sir Roderick came forward with ice, still she said nothing. Rob realized he did not know her name. He took the sword from the man who had taught him how to fight, and wondered if Sir Roderick had ever thought that his young charge would one day use a weapon against a woman. The girl knelt willingly, and laid her head as gently on the block as though it were a pillow. "Here in sight of gods and man, I judge you guilty of murder. In mine own name I condemn you. With mine own hand I take your life. Would you speak a final word?" She would not. She looked up to him with eyes so dark they almost seemed black, her last defiance. When he brought ice down, it seemed to him that someone gasped. The girl's head rolled to his feet, and Harwin collected it, while Hwood carried the rest of her body away. Her conspirator was not so docile. She had to be dragged through the crowd, screaming incomprehensibly, her brown hair flying wildly around her face. There was mud up to her knees from where she had tried to dig into the ground, and across her face was an ugly bruise. When she was brought before him, he did not have so much as a chance to say a single word before she spat in his face. Wordlessly, he wiped it away with the back of his sleeve as she shouted on about Neela's butchering them all like pigs, and repeated his words as she raved on. In the end, Sir Roderick and Jory had to hold her down by her shoulders upon the block, and all the while she struggled against them, feet kicking at the ground. Rob's aim did not falter, and when ice fell, it killed her in one blow. No one spoke after that. For a while, it seemed they did not dare move, but slowly, one by one, each witness melted back into Winterfell, back to the glass gardens, or the kitchens, or the dark cellars where they had taken refuge, across to the guards' hall and up to the walls, to take in hand swords of their own. Northmen crowded around him afterwards, telling him that what he did was just, that he had avenged all of the North, but he could hardly remember what he said in return. It was his mother he wanted to hear from, to repeat the words of his bannerman, to reassure him that he wasn't a monster after all, although he had women's blood on his hands. But he wasn't a boy, despite how young and lost he felt, and his mother had other children to care for. Rob could not bring himself to ask after his own children. More and more each day, his worst fears had begun to take shape, of his son and daughter, helpless and alone. Dark thoughts bloomed in his heart, porous and shifting and dark as clouds, that it might have been better if his children had never come into a world such as this. If his wedding had been but a year or two later, if he had not taken to his wife's bed with such fervor, if... The thoughts felt dirty as a sin. His mother walked away with Sansa, hand in hand, and Rob returned to the Godswood, to clean the blood off ice. There was no one waiting for him this time, neither spectre nor man. The soldiers had returned to their posts and the ghosts, such as they were, had returned to their crypts and to their rest. Alone he knelt by the pool, and dipped his handkerchief in the still waters, black as night. Upon its surface, the reflection of the weirwood danced, its red leaves rustling, its eyes staring at him. The blood came off easily, as though it had never happened at all. But Rob would not forget. If he owed those women anything, it was that, at least. Wind whistled through the trees and it seemed to Rob that the air grew cold and colder, until his very breath was frosting in the air. He was not so naive as to misunderstand its meaning. Sword in hand he rose, as the sky filled with 1,000 red stars, and the storm of fire arrows rained over him, hissing as they searched for their target to the east. Rob ran through the Godswood, as swiftly as when he walked on 4 feet and not 2, and had reached the crypts in time to see the 2 dragons locked in a deadly embrace, one bronze and one of ice, falling through the sky as though shot out by a catapult. "Bring it down!" Rob shouted, and heard the call repeated, again and again, as all the world became smoke and arrows. The dragon's tail slapped against the first keep and Rob darted into the crypts in time to see the stones and gargoyles and wood raining all around the Lycoyard. He heard the screams of frightened horses, and men, and when he blinked, the dragons were still falling, twisted up in one another, until the canopy of the Godswood met them. The roar that came from the wood cleaved the world in two, it shook the towers, threatening to bring them down too, and after the beast fell silent, Rob's ears were ringing. He ran, jumping over and dodging the fallen pieces of his tower, some as small as pebbles, some as large as mammoths, and plunged back into the woods. Ice felt heavy in his hands. That would not do. He adjusted his grip until it felt more comfortable and took step after cautious step, shifting his weight each time so his boots would not press down overly hard on the snowy ground and catch in the enemy's ears. His path followed the sounds of a struggle, of snarling, and a road that was cut with trees that had freshly fallen, barks as thick as 6 feet wide broken in two as though some giant had snapped them between his hands. From behind the trees he saw it, a monster with flesh that gleamed with a faint blue glow, and changed color as it moved, reflecting the white of the snow, the green of the trees, the bronze of the other dragon, the dragon that was made of flesh, twisting in the mud where it had fallen, thrashing and snapping its massive teeth. Great chunks had been pulled from the ice dragon, enough to kill creatures of this earth, but not enough to kill it. Its armor had reformed around its wounds, in some places so large and deep that Rob could look straight through them. The bronze dragon was injured, too, and bloody, though not as badly as the other. Rob guessed by its gait and the long streak of mud across its side that it was the fall that had done the worst of the damage. All he knew of dragons he had learned from Daenerys or from watching them in battle, and Rob had learned that with a single word the riders could unleash the flame that burned hotter than any fire. Why the king did not do the same now, Rob could not understand. Aegon was still in his saddle, sword in hand, pulling at the chains around his waist. If he is here, Daenerys will be close. But he could not wait. It was growing cold, so cold that each time he breathed was like plunging into frozen water. The barks of the trees were beginning to frost, like some disease, beginning first around the roots and crawling upwards, as slow and steady as the spill of honey. Rob fell back into the trees and moved as swiftly as he could, trying to draw around so he could reach the king, knowing that with each step he risked death instead from Aegon's dragon, the one Daenerys had named Sea Flame. But the others were drawn to the heat, or so the stories told, and if that was so then so were the beasts that served them, for the ice dragon wheeled around its massive head and looked at him with eyes as blue and terrible as the sea. From its massive nostrils came a fine spray of snow. When it opened its jaws, it spat out ice. The sentinel Rob dodged behind turned brittle, and cracked, and for a long moment he felt as though he were frozen too, that its dark magic had reached him despite his efforts and stripped down all the warmth from him. It took a great effort for him to move once more, stretching first his fingers and then moving his toes, half frozen in his boots, to put one foot in front of the other and circle around and risk a look from behind the tree. Sea Flame had lurched to his feet and was snapping and roaring, but Rob could see now that there was no fire behind its teeth. That frightened him in more ways than he could put to word or thought. The ice dragon circled it, but neither were yet ready to move into close. Rob prepared to dart between the trees, to reach Egon, but the thought was a helpless one now. The only dragon he had ever drawn close to was the one Daenerys had claimed, and only in her presence. Even under her watch, his heart was in his throat each time. Something in the beast's molten eyes seemed to him like a warning, that which the dragon might tolerate his presence now, it would not be for long. Egon's dragon would take him for foe, and in the time it took for it to twist its neck around and make a meal of him, the ice dragon would have an opening to draw near and rip them all to shreds. Instead, he drew closer to the ice dragon. How he had loved the stories of Egon's conquest as a boy. Rob had been too young then to understand what it had meant for the Stark kings of old to give up their crown, and so he would sit and imagine the sight of Torrhen Stark marching his host down the neck and Egon the Conqueror racing ahead on Balrion's wings to meet him. The king in the North's scouts had been sent ahead to see the ruins of Harrenhal, where slow, red fires still burned beneath the rubble, and accounts had reached him of the Field of Fire. It was then, as he thought over what to do, his ears filled with the words of his bannermen and all their different counsel, that his bastard half-brother Brandon Snow offered to cross the Trident alone under cover of darkness, to slay the dragons whilst they slept. Had Brandon Snow understood what that truly meant? It was one thing for a man to think he might take down a dragon as it circled above, as small as a bird, but another to be only feet away from it, and willingly draw himself closer. Each time he was close to Daenerys' dragon, sweat would pool uncomfortably under his skin, as though it were the height of summer. With each step he took towards the ice dragon, goose pimples rose up on his skin and set his teeth to chattering. Across the clearing, Egon had at last unbound himself from his chains and slid from the saddle, sword in hand, to come between his dragon and the beast made of ice. Their eyes met, only for an instant, but the ice dragon saw it and lurched its head back around towards Rob. He swung at it with ice, but it was as fast as a snake, and his sword met the ground instead. It gathered its breath then, its throat swelling up with frost. Egon shouted out something inscrutable, once, twice, and on the third the ice dragon turned to face him, swinging its tail back around so swiftly Rob had to duck to avoid being crushed against it. King and dragon moved towards each other, and Rob joined their terrible, deadly dance. He pulled ice from the ground and followed. When the ice dragon at last made its attack, all were prepared. Egon jumped towards its open mouth, his skinny sword in hand. His dragon used the strength that remained to it to raise a claw and rake it across the enemy's side, and from its other side, Rob plunged ice into its belly. The ice dragon's scales ran down its body in rivulets as pale blue blood hissed and steamed around ice. Before his eyes it began to shrink and puddle, dissolving away until its flesh was gone, swirling away in a fine white mist. Its massive bones were like milk glass, pale and shiny, and melting quickly until only emptiness divided Egon and Rob. For a moment, the king wavered, and Rob thought that he too might fall, but somehow, he found his footing. His dragon seemed similarly drained. It collapsed to the ground with such force that mud and earth splattered on his face. Daenerys was the first word from Rob's mouth. Egon put the point of his sword into the ground, leaned on the hilt, flying still. Her dragon is stronger. He was out of breath, and the effort to speak seemed to drain him. Rob. The others are here. They are riding from the east. It only made sense, he thought, dully. They had sent their servants before them to weaken and break them, and now they would come. I'll send help for you, wait here. Wordlessly, Egon nodded, and Rob left him there, and left the Godswood at last, in time to see the Kingsguard plunging in, the Red Viper at their side and with them 30 knights or more. He shouted out to them his news and left them to their king. The others did not come for a full day, and that was almost enough to make Rob believe in the gods again. It bought them time to prepare, to reposition the catapults and wooden cranes on his walls, to carve more arrows and bows, and set into place the barrels of oil upon the parapets. It bought him time to speak with the men, to share words of encouragement with those who seemed most frightened, to hear from his bannerman a final time. And Rob gave the command he had not thought to give, not in truth, and sent Sir Roderick to choose those among the women who showed the most courage and skill and arm them. And it bought him time to rest. Rob went to the gatehouse unwillingly, 1,000 thoughts wrapped around his mind, 100 threads and worries of things he might have forgotten, or missed, certain that there was no chance at all that he might sleep. But when he lay his head on the hard pillow, he fell into a deep, dreamless sleep and woke feeling clear-headed and certain he had not in many long days. The king's dragon was exhausted almost to the point death, but Egon had found his strength and climbed the walls to stand beside Winterfell's men. The whites had been thoughtless creatures, throwing themselves again and again against Winterfell's walls, trying to overwhelm them with sheer numbers. And they almost had. But this was another sort of enemy altogether. They were impossible to count, and difficult to track in the blizzard. They had no choice but to fire their arrows then, one round after another, lighting up the sky so brightly that it shone off the others' armors and they appeared, like red ghosts in the snow. The most skilled archers were tasked with picking them off, mostly Crannog men but some Dornishmen too, using the precious obsidian arrowheads of which they had precious few. They met their mark, and for a whole day they fought thus, steady, unfailing, Winterfell filled with the music of battle, and the counts of notch, draw, loose called out like a chant. They held their position for days, their arrows unfaltering, though he did not know if he could say the same of the men's hearts. They could not count the others, no more than they could see what victory might look like. It was not mere survival, Rob was certain of that. One day the arrows would run out, or the wildlings within his walls would rise up again, and the enemy would wash over them as easily as a wave. Already he had begun to fret over the ways that the snow piled up against his walls. The 100-feet-deep drifts old Nan had once told them stories of had come to pass, and if the heat within Winterfell, the others would not even have to scale the walls to reach them. It was the hour of the wolf when those beasts that might have been wyverns descended once more. The archers were harried after that, a quarter of them he commanded to keep their eyes, and arrows, on the wyverns, the rest on the others, who risked to draw closer now on their monstrous horses. They unleashed the catapults for the first time, firing barrels of burning pitch from the outer walls, as the air rang with the sound of scorpions loosing their fire spears. Rob gave the command for the men to fire at will and descended below. There were not many wyverns who made it past Winterfell's defenders, but those who did fell upon the ground like snowflakes. The Blackfish had taken the most fearless of men to guard Winterfell's grounds, and they fought now against wyvern with spear and torch and sword dripped in pitch. There was one outside the guards' hall, surrounded by men already. It broke through, and spat out its ice over two of Arnfulf Karstark's grandsons, who whimpered and fell to the ground, shaking and shuddering as their faces grew black with frostbite, before falling dead. The great Jon dispatched it with an obsidian spear through its guts. There were more when he crossed beneath the bridge between the armory and the great keep. Rob fought against one alongside the heir of Pink Maiden Castle, and when they had at last vanquished the creature, round to Guest House, where a wyvern had already felled a half-dozen men, and was rounding around to the kennels. Rob saw Shaggydoak first, and then Lady and Nymeria, spring forward, snarling and growling, their teeth wrapped around the wyvern's neck, tearing it to shreds. It was a knight of House Celtigar who drew Rob's attention to what was happening in the tower, shouting out from the courtyard where a body of the wyvern lay melting. One of the beasts had landed on the top of the Maester's turret, its icy scales turning blue and black and white by turns from the strange lights that emerged from the room where Bran and Marwyn the Midge sat over their magic. Rob ran across Winterfell as he had not since he was a boy at play, pretending to be the young dragon or Florian the Fool or some other mighty hero on a quest to rescue a princess or slay a beast. When he reached the tower, he took the steps two at a time and arrived at the door with his heart beating so loudly he could hear little else save its harried notes. Beyond the door, Summer lay on the floor and Bran and the Grand Maester were across a table laid with books and parchments, and the single candle burning so queerly at which they stared so intently that they did not seem to notice his arrival. Bran. His little brother looked up at him with surprise, but not fear. It's all right. We have to go, now. Bran rose, but not to join him. Instead, he pushed aside the tapestry on the wall and threw open the window. Rob ran to him then and grabbed him by the shoulders, but as he did it seemed to him the air was full with the sound of birds singing, and the murmur of crickets, and leaves rustling in a gentle wood. Sword in hand, his brother in the other, Rob chanced to look outside. It is as it was, he thought with an ache in his heart. Fires raged outside the walls where the casks of burning pitch had exploded, and in the courtyards the men raised their swords and spears against them, with curses and shouts on their lips. And then it seemed to him that the clouds were not so dark after all. In fact, the dawn was clear and cold, the air crisp as summer. For the first time in weeks, he could see beyond Winterfell's walls. The blizzard had ended, and what fell from the sky now was no more than a summer snow. I am drunk on battle, Rob thought, but there were the soldiers below, and the fire arrows rising and falling beyond. What is this? He breathed. It's the day we found the direwolves. It was the day I could remember clearest, but I can't bring it all back, not in a way that anyone can see but me. Rob whipped his head around to the maester. What is the meaning of this? Even now, Marwyn the Midge chewed on his sour leaf, as though it were not the day to end all days. There were dark rings around his eyes, though, and he held on to the arms of his chair as though for purchase. The world is made of magic, Lord Stark, and your brother has learned the spells that shape it. He spat out the leaf in a cup, and wiped the juice that stained his teeth and mouth on his sleeve. He molded it into what every young boy wishes. A journey with a beloved father, at the end of which awaited an unexpected present on a warm, summer day. The maester smiled a gruesome smile. Summer. It seemed that Bran's direwolf heard his thoughts. He raised his head and looked at Rob with his yellow eyes. Enough, Rob commanded. He pulled the window closed, and threw the tapestry back over it. All three of you, get to the cellars now. The Grand Maester rose in no particular hurry, and leaned across the table to put out the candle, plunging the room into darkness. Rob led them out then, Summer leading the way, and when they reached the lower levels, parted from his brother with an embrace and a promise that he would do as Rob said. Their words only made sense when he was outside. The men had dispatched the last of the wyverns and were rallying around the Blackfish, as the wolves raced around them, howling. Rob began to remember then. His little brother had recently turned 7, and his father had deemed him old enough to see justice then. Jon had been with them, when he still smiled, and perhaps dreamt dreams where he did not wear a black cloak. They rode out to a holdfast in the hills where his father brought down ice over the deserter's head. Rob had raced his cousin as they rode back and had found the direwolves on the riverbank north of the bridge. The memory of Grey Wind when he was only a pup pained him now, but he had been so happy then, almost giddy with the joy. He felt warmer. Enough perhaps, to make a difference. It was late summer then and the snowdrifts were knee-deep, and while a southern man might pale at that, he who might pass a whole lifetime without seeing snow, to a northerner it was nothing. He took his place on the wall once more aside his archers, sheathed ice at last and had Skittrick bring him a bow of his own. At last, they could see their enemy. The others did not form lines as a West AOC army did, each block led by a commander. They were all a horse, in smaller groups, the largest of them no more than 20 each, and though the great mass of them came from the east as Egon had said, they were everywhere, besieging Winterfell from all sides. The horizon was now visible. The sky was painted red, and a stream of fire exploded towards the ground. Notch, draw, loose, Rob called, and unleashed his bow, over and over. Without cloaking themselves in the storm, the others were wary of drawing close to Winterfell. For hours they sent other servants instead, snow bears the size of aurochs and wolves, all armored in ice, savage and terrible to assail the walls and test the archer's skill. Winterfell was alight and Daenerys' dragon was making a red ruin of the hills, and by evenfall, the others were retreating, racing over the snow as though gliding on water as they made for the Wolf's Wood. There were cheers then, as though they had all been holding their breath and at last could exhale. Rob was not so cold as to rob them of that. He left them to their relief, and their hope, tasked Jory with taking stock of the repairs that must be made and the corpses that must be burned, and sort out the Blackfish. By midnight, the plan had come into focus. There was no time for debate, for calling for a council and weighing each man's words carefully. There was time only to ready the horses, and meet their fates. Rob chose the men who would know what he meant, and be prepared for it. Benjen Stark was among them, the Blackfish and Arnulf Karstark. He would take no young lords with him, refusing the men who left behind no heirs and would leave chaos after them. He chose men, strong still, but with beards streaked with grey, all except for one. The king was atop the Hunter's Gate, watching the sky. When he first met Egon, his anger had burned hot as treason. It was there even now, like a steady fire, fed a little each day so the flames did not die down, but it was still enough that day that he could look upon his king without his fists clenching. But when he did, all he could wonder at was what Daenerys saw. Did she find him handsome? That was often said of Egon, and had been said of Viserys too, who was remarked to look almost as a twin to Rhaegar when he was young a man. The Dornish Queen Elia was said to be beautiful, and Robb could see the marks she had left behind in her son, in the shade of his skin, in his dimples, and the shape of his eyes lined with thick eyelashes. There was a healed scar through his top lip. Was that the type of thing that might thrill a maiden? Was that the type of thing that might thrill Robb's wife? He had given little thought to what Daenerys might have dreamed of before she became his wife. No doubt she would have preferred a prince, to a savage northerner whose kin but a generation before had fought hers. No doubt she would have preferred to be Lady of Dragonstone, the only home she had ever known. When Egon asked her to be his queen, had she been tempted, even for a moment? The thoughts were endless and pointless, and foolish, most of all. What did jealousy and dishonor matter, against this? "I've written a will," said the king. Robb was taken aback. "My uncle and yours served as witnesses and I left in the care of your maester. I've named the son of Viserys Targaryen and my cousin Arianne as my heir. It is his right, but dragons have a way of confusing things." Egon's lips quirked into what might have been a smile. "There'll be war, though I don't have to warn you of all people about that." "There's already war, your grace." His smile faded. "Lord Tyrell will set himself a regent and find some infant in his family tree to betroth to Meryn. But I suppose those battles will fall to someone else." He sighed. "You mean to ride out to the Wolfswood, I've heard." "Yes," Robb said. "For the first time, the others have fallen back. I won't wait for them to regather and besiege Winterfell once again. I will meet them in the Wolfswood and make an end to it. You have obsidian spears for your riders?" "Yes. Each man is armed and ready. And awaiting me." Egon cut to the quick. "Sea Flame is badly weakened, but there is no hope if I don't take him to the sky." "Yes," Robb said, again. How queer it was that this would be the first, and most likely last, time that he and the king would agree on so much. "I thought not." At last, the king turned to Robb, and regarded him with his dark purple eyes. "At least you will not be able to say that I was a craven, Lord Stark." "No. Not that." It seemed to Robb the king smiled again, but he had turned then, off to do his duty, and Robb to do his. The thought of bidding farewell to his family tugged at him, tempting but dangerous, and quickly buried. He needed all of his strength now, and his courage, and could not spend it on painful goodbyes, and on shed tears. When he measured it all, he could say he had been a good son, and a good brother too. As for a good father, he hardly had the chance to try, but Cregan loved him, though Alara was too young yet. "But I tried." They rode out, 200 strong, with the moon high in the sky, each man carrying a torch, their garrons fitted with bare paws so they may move more easily above the snow. When the gates of Winterfell closed behind them, the air grew bitter cold, but when the king took to the sky, and the sight of the dragon's wings unfurling before them, it tempered the worst of it. "Stark," they called from the walls, as their horses began to gallop. "Winterfell." The call was taken up by one of the Liddles who rode beside him. "Winterfell. Winterfell." His companion repeated, as his castle began to shrink behind them, and the forest to rise on the horizon. The holdfast to which they had ridden on the day they found the direwolves, the one Bran remembered with such care, had been to the north. They rode west now, and his brother's magic had no hold here. Snow kicked up all around them, and fell around their shoulders, but Egon's voice rang out from high atop his dragon, and in response, his beast darted down and laid down a line of fire dividing the forest in two, shielding them the north and cutting off any enemy ambush. The wind blew ashes and embers through the sky, and there was a great roar and crash as the trees cracked and fell. And then another, even greater, though this one more familiar. Daenerys and her dragon had come, and circled around Egon, as though in greeting, before both plunged further west, in search of their enemy. At their tails was a third dragon. Rob saw in wonder and shock, and as it darted down into the wood with them, a single long blast of a great horn shuddered through the trees and echoed off the ice. Rob and his riders turned back to meet the sound and saw that lumbering towards them were mammoths, more than 50, with giant riders on their backs clutching mauls and huge stone axes. The massive creatures trumpeted and were quickly outpaced by men on garrons, moving quickly across the snow. By the light of the torches they carried, Rob could see their black cloaks. To the woods! Rob cried, and the riders wheeled back around, to face the enemy, and their fates. Notes. 2 more chapters to go. It feels quite surreal to be so close to finishing, and I really, genuinely hope you enjoy these very final chapters. Once again, I am so grateful for your readership and for your time. It's always quite tricky to figure out how much to reveal when it comes to Bran's magic, or how to find that balance between explaining too much and leaving things confusing. To clarify it here, from the last chapter we know Bran is potentially playing a part in reanimating the Whites and making them fight the others outside Winterfell's walls. In this chapter, we see that within Winterfell's walls, he's able to effectively push Winter back, but folding into the present his memory of the day Rob found the direwolves. In other words, he's using his ability to move through time to bring an old vision of Winterfell into the present that helps to hold the storm enough for them to expose the others' positions and force them to retreat. Chapter 59, Jon 11. Notes. I had previously updated a version of this chapter, but after beginning to write the final chapter and reflecting on the comments, I decided to take it down and make a few changes. If you already read the previous one and don't want to reread it, you can skip ahead to the end of Jon's conversation with Lyanna. See the end of the chapter for more notes. Chapter text. In his bed, the Lord of Winterfell lay sleeping, in a haze of poppied sleep, healing from a wound he had taken to his side. It was in this same room that Rob had passed his boyhood. Jon remembered hiding in here together, when they were children, playing rats and cats, and telling each other their secrets, sometimes crying together when there was no one else to see. An age ago, he helped Rob dress for his wedding, and turned away, bashful and embarrassed, when Lord Eddard had come and begun to speak to his son of his duties in the marriage bed. How young they had both been then. Now the room was filled with all the traces of the life his cousin had led since they were last here together. There was a child's toy on the table, and a babe's swaddling clothes strewn over a chair, and here and there items that Daenerys had left behind, a brush with silver hair tangled in it, a bracelet of gold, a pair of small slippers. Once or twice, Rob woke from his sleep and looked around wordlessly, before falling to slumber once more. Whoever was at his bedside then, whether it was Jon or Daenerys or Lady Catelyn, would try to talk to him then, but he never seemed to hear them. But when his eyes fell upon these things, they must have given him comfort. The wound was slowly closing, and Rob had shown no signs of fever, and so for the last few days Maester Luwin was giving him less milk of the poppy each day, and letting him slowly come out of his sleep. It was Jon and the Maester who were with him, when he woke at last. The Maester rose out of his chair with a quickness that surprised him, looked long at the wound, and asked Rob question after question, to make sure his mind was whole, for his name and his father's name and his house, and who were his siblings, and who was the woman he wed, and what color was his children's hair. Rob groaned through every question, holding his head as though it pained him, and Jon in the end asked Maester Luwin to go fetch Daenerys and Lady Catelyn so his cousin might have a moment to himself. Rob blinked hard, as though trying to banish the heaviness from his eyes, and turned to Jon. "Did we defeat them?" he asked, his voice slurred and drowsy. "Yes. You're in Winterfell. You took a wound in your side, and you have been sleeping for a week." "Oh." He wiped at his eyes. "Is it summer then?" "No, I wish that it was. It is winter still, but not near as fierce. Nothing to frighten a Northman at least." Confused as he was, Rob did not seem to catch his meaning. He struggled against the furs that had pulled high up to his neck, as though drowning and trying to work his way out, and just when Jon was about to go to his aid, he seemed to remember enough of what had happened to calm himself. "The battle. I saw your dragon and your wildlings, but I didn't understand. How did you come south?" Jon would have stayed at the wall forever, but he could not tell Rob that, or else everything else would unravel with it, and those were things he would take to his death, his true and final death, if it ever chanced to find him. He had watched indifferently as Daenerys and Aegon left on their dragons, with their men. The rest of the days were dark, and what little he remembered of them were terrible. It was as though he was underwater, trying to speak and feeling cold water fill his lungs each time he did, moving so sluggish and slow he might as well have been as old as Maester Eamon. He remembered the stench. It assaulted him, the smell of terrible decay, and he would be sure that he was rotting, and that when he woke his skin would be sloughed off, his guts full of maggots, and he would don his black cloak to try to cover it. In the beginning, he would have his steward pour him a bath, and John would scrub as his skin with the boiling water until it was red and raw. It did nothing for the smell, and sometimes all he could do was weep like a child, and bury his face in ghost's fur. Some days, John still smelled it. When he first arrived in Winterfell, he had dared ask Daenerys if she did too, but she had looked at him so sadly and assured him that she could not. Perhaps that was why he had ridden out to Sable Hall. Horlek had sent one of his cousins to Long Barrow, to warn that supplies were dangerously low and they would have no choice but to send a hunting party to the haunted forest soon. John determined that he would lead it, and it was not out of bravery or suicidal heroism, as one had once called it, but the simple need to be outside, where the winds might carry off his smell, where the cold might preserve him. The beasts that he was bound to, for better or worse, were grateful for it too. The dragon unfurled her wings and took off for the east, and Ghost followed John's party for a while, before catching the scent of some prey in the gift and darting off. He rode out with Aaron, Imric, and Hereth, and the others found them outside Rymegate. The wall was nothing more than a stump here, the stones scattered across the ground as far as the eye could see, making their ride a treacherous one, and so when the White Riders fell upon them, there was no chance of easy retreat. His companions fell quickly, and John prepared to make his stand, but even as John stood in the snow, Longclaw in hand, the others sheathed their own swords, and walked back to their mounts in that strange, graceful way of theirs. For a moment it seemed as though they did not see him, and he would have wondered if all of this was but a dream, or perhaps, some cursed land between heaven and hell where he had been sent to wander, but for their cruel, blue eyes that seemed to watch him. They only hate the living, the warm, John had thought, as the terrible army rode past him, as though he were no more than another stone. What do they want with a dead man? It had taken a while to return to Long Barrow then, his horse long since having bolted, and felt as though he were truly the last man left in Westeros. And ever would be, if he had remained at the wall. They would sweep over everything, and when it was done, who would remain but him, a spectre doomed to haunt the ruined castles that had once been his charge. He was so lost that the thought did not altogether frighten him. It took seeing Ghost again to remember. There were five instead of 6, and they would be gone too. Robb would never understand that. In the state he was in, he was likely to forget as soon as John had gotten the words out. We can speak about it when your head is clearer. And my men. That was harder still to say. The party that had ridden out from Winterfell had borne the brunt of the others' attack in the woods, and half were dead, and much of the rest lay dying or injured. They had not lived long enough to hear the whispers coming from the trees that told them where the enemy was lurking in the dark, in the boyish voice that could belong to none other than Brandon Stark. Those who did not heed it, who buried it down or brushed it off, thinking perhaps they were going mad, or else, it was some trick of the enemy, could not ignore the ravens that woke from the branches, shaking off the frost from their wings, nor the wolves that joined the battle, running alongside Ghost, nor the bears that sprung up from beneath the snow and made common cause with them against their enemy. All of that had melted away, and more. The 3 dragons had spat out their flame together downwind, and it was a wonder that there were trees in the Wolf's Wood still after that. Theirs was a spectacle to marvel, the field of fire, and when at last their fire sputtered and the others fled deeper into the wood, they met Stannis Baratheon's army, and with torches and obsidian spears, at last the world was freed. Robb Stark had woken to sunshine, the likes of which no one had seen north of the Neck since autumn, and to chaos. The same chaos to which I arrived. He had come to Winterfell to find Mance Rayder in chains in the dungeons, and that alone did not surprise him, but the presence of Val in a neighboring cell did. His anger had been fierce then, and he'd almost come to blows with Jory Castle before Sir Roderick came between them, and explained that she was held at the Lord of Winterfell's command, and only the Lord of Winterfell could free her. He heard the story from Munda later, who he guessed had told it more than once, and loudly. The attack on the Golas, the execution of the Free Folk, and how Robb Stark had refused to arm them, even with the enemy at the gate, and crowded them like sheep in his cellar. The rumors that passed between the free folk were ugly. The Stark Lord would kill them all before summer was here, they said, and the Northmen would feast on their blood. He had taken Val for his bed slave, and would see them all in chains. Ugly tales were told of every great lord in the realm, and the free folk had been fighting the Starks for centuries. But never without the wall in between them. Of all of the free folk, it was Sigorn, Magna of Then, and Tormund Giantsbane who most worried him. Jon had been surprised, and a little more than suspicious, to find that Egon too dealt with them as such. The king, who never shown more than a passing interest in the free folk and their matters, feasted Sigorn and Tormund at his own table, and more than once had been seen among the giants, with leathers in tow to translate his words to the old tongue. Egon means to call a council. Before then, we will speak of all of this and more. But now you much rest. Egon. Robb turned the word into a curse. Do you know what he did to my wife? Don't trouble yourself with that now. When I see him, I will kill him. Jon frowned. They were alone for now, but even so those words could not pass from Robb's lips, poppy drunk as he was. No, you will not. For a moment Robb was quiet, before deciding no, I won't. Some of his strength seemed to leave him then, and he sagged against his pillow. I'm not the same man since Grey Wind was killed, he said, quietly. I feel as though I am moving through the world half blind, with one arm tied behind my back. You fought bravely. Robb scoffed, but the effort must have pained him because his face twisted, and his hand went to his side. I am held together with thread. There's a draught with milk of the poppy by your bed. Drink some. He shook his head. No, I have had my fill of that to last a lifetime. When I saw you sat by my bed, for a moment I took you for Daenerys. Jon laughed. Is that your way of calling me beautiful, Stark? Don't flatter yourself, Robb said, grinning. Maester Lewin has gone to fetch her. No doubt she's running breathless to come to your side now. Robb quickly grew sober. How is she? Was she hurt? No, she was untouched. She's well, perhaps a bit weary of wrangling every day with your bannerman. The Northerners knew the princess but little, and seemed to trust her less. She had been half a child when she arrived in Winterfell, and Ned Stark's bannerman had lingered only long enough to see her bedded and wedded, and now she stood before them with a dragon, and tried to rule in Robb's name. Some took that easier than others. Harry Oncar Stark was courteous, and Lord Dustin kind, and Sir Willis spoke to her overlong of his daughter Wyla, who had once been in her service, as though to remind her. But others were not so easy to win. Harry On's kin were a quarrelsome sort, and though Arnulf had died in the Wolf's Wood, he left behind sons and grandsons who misliked her every word. The Umbers and the Mountain clans were similarly inimical. Daenerys worked hard to win them, but when she lost her patience, she could be as fierce as her dragon. Just last night she had quarreled with the great Jon over who would have the honor of leading a hunting party to the woods, and stood before him, small and slight as she was, unmoving and unyielding. Whether the Lord of Last Hearth would respect or loathe her for it, time would tell. It would do no good to worry Robb now, when he could hardly do so much as lift his head up. As it turns out, she's quite skilled at arguing. I could have told you that much. As though summoned, the door opened and the princess appeared, hair wild and cheeks red, as though she had run a great distance to come here. It was Maester Aemon who had told him that love was the bane of honor. It was true for men such as them, who were wed to their duty, but not for those who had wed princesses. Daenerys raced to Robb's bedside, took his hand in hers, brought it to her lips, and gently kissed it. And then she leaned over the bed, held his face in her hand, and kissed him. Robb kissed her back. I'm so glad you're awake. Everything hurts, Robb said, so softly it might as well have been a whisper. With his free hand, he pushed down the furs that covered him and pulled up his shirt to reveal the wound, wrapped in linen bandages. They were recently cleaned, and spotless, but at the sight of them, Jon found his own hand going to his chest, to his heart. Whether for his sake, or for Robb's, she gently pulled his hand away from his side, and pulled down his shirt once more to cover it. Should we fetch him milk of the poppy? Daenerys asked him. He says he does not want it. My head is too heavy. Will you help me rise? Stop being stubborn, Jon said. You'll be up soon enough. Have something to eat first, you need to regain your strength. I'll fetch it, Daenerys said. If I eat anything now, I'll retch it up. No, stay. Both of you stay. It seemed he sunk a little into his pillow then. Do I look ghastly? Daenerys shook her head, not ghastly at all. I trimmed your hair and beard while you were sleeping. I feel drunk, Robb sighed, or else I am in a dream. Jon grinned, perhaps you have had too much milk of the poppy. Daenerys was not so amused. She returned her hand to his cheek, her look full of concern. Suddenly, he felt like an intruder. As he rose from his seat, excuses on his tongue, the door opened and Arya burst in, as fast as the wind, and fell into Robb's arms, pulling away only once Robb began to wince in pain. When she did, Jon could see there were tears on her cheeks. Robb. I thought you were. I thought, she couldn't bring herself to say it, and angrily wiped at her face with her sleeve. Arya Stark was still a little girl, after all. So little touched him now, but that had heartened him, that for all that had passed, all she had seen, she could still weep. In the end, the little sword he had made for her served some good after all. She had told him the tale himself, half frightened, half excited. Creatures made of ice, with terrible wings, had fallen on the tower where the women and children sheltered, and dug into the ground like WYRMS, attracted no doubt by the warmth of those who were sheltered below. Some of the women and girls had taken a handful of Sir Roderick's lessons, not enough to make them warriors, but they were armed, and had more bravery than skill. They had harried the creature, pushing it back until Edmure Tully and Mark Piper came upon them, and burned it. I'm all better. The discomfort was clear on Robb's face, though, but Arya did not see it for her joy and relief. Rickon was next, though he seemed not to know what to do once he had entered, and awkwardly lingered by the foot of the bed. Bran was not so hesitant, he burst in, as Arya had, red-faced and out of breath, but when he embraced his brother, Robb winced. Their smiles faltered then, until Lady Catelyn and Sansa arrived, both gentler, and more cautious, with tears brimming in their eyes. It was not so easy to know what to say once all cheeks were dry, and they had seen Robb for themselves, and asked after his health and how he fared. There was nothing to speak of except war, but even Rickon and Bran, young as they were, knew not to darken the room with that. For many long moments, it was a quiet save for the sound of the fire crackling in the hearth, and then the door opened one final time and it was Jon's mother who entered, with Cregan Stark in tow. The little boy threw himself on the bed and would have thrown himself on his father if Daenerys had not risen and drawn him in more gently so that when Robb took him into his arms, it was on his left side, and far from his injuries. The boy was whispering something in Robb's ear that made him smile and kiss him on the cheek. The sight of it seemed to lighten everyone's hearts, and it was not long before his cousins started chattering, lovingly teasing Cregan or speaking over one another to tell some tale they thought Robb would like. Jon's mother came to stand by him, a smile on her lips. She had helped care for Craig in Daenerys' absence, and Jon had seen enough since his return to Winterfell to know how deeply she loved him. The child was easy to love, his hair was a bundle of auburn curls, the silver patch forever falling across his blue eyes, and Robb's features writ clear across his face. He was as much Robb's son as Alara was Daenerys' daughter. Alara. It was strange what came back to him, and when. The easiest memories returned quickly, but the dark ones were thick as honey, and came slowly, languidly. Somehow, he knew she had not been called that when he had gone to Tormund and negotiated for her life, but he could not think of what her true name might have been. It was not just memories that returned, here and there, but dark thoughts long vanquished. He watched Robb with his son, his wife at his side, his daughter a few doors away in the nursery, and Jon wondered if he would someday hold a son of his own blood in his arms. This time he did reach up, and touch his chest, fingering through his clothes the wound the other had dealt him. When he rose to leave, and bid Robb farewell, no one seemed to notice much. Winterfell was much changed since the days of his visits, long ago. His uncle Ned had been given Jon his own room then and told him he would have a place there so long as he wanted it. But nothing was kept the same after all. The castle was full to the brim as it never had before, even in the days of the harvest feasts, and it was Lord Jon Arryn who slept in that room now, healing still from his wounds. The room Jon had been given was a level down, and not near as spacious. It mattered little to him where he slept, so long as there was a fire in the hearth and a place near it for him to lay down his head. Ghost had beat him to it. The white wolf had taken over John's bed, nestling among the furs, watching him with red eyes as though waiting for him to banish him to the floor. John did no such thing. He scratched his wolf behind his ears and sat in a chair by the fire. It was only a moment after that his mother entered. She greeted Ghost as he had, before coming to stand by the flames. "You can have that, you know," his mother said, softly. "What do you mean?" "A child, a family, a home." Those words were sharp as the edge of a dragon-glass blade. "Those days are gone," he told her. "No, they are not." His mother sat across from him. "You are young, and strong, and of noble blood. It will not be hard for you to find a woman who will love you and give you children. I am a man of the Night's Watch. I took my vows before the weirwood. I cannot unsay them." He had broken his vows once, he had not forgotten that, nor had he forgotten red hair, kissed by fire. Suddenly, John wondered if that tale had reached his mother. The wall is gone and there is no living man with the skill to rebuild it. The wall may be gone, but not the watch. I know the words, as you do. I am the fire that burns against the cold, the light that brings the dawn, the horn that wakes the sleepers, the shield that guards the realms of men. You have fulfilled your vows down to the last man, you and Benjen both. Has he spoke to you of this? Has he said something?" She half smiled. "No, he is as bad as you." He had never known his uncle as anything other than a man of the Night's Watch. The thought of him holding a holdfast for Rob perhaps, with a wife and children of his own, living the life he might have had if he had never joined the Watch, unsettled John. What of his other brothers, who had come to the wall as rapists and thieves? No lord would want them in his lands. There were no warm welcomes awaiting them, only scorn and one day no doubt the dank rot of dungeon cells. "I had my reasons for joining the Watch, mother. Those have not changed." Lyanna Stark knew what they were better than anyone. John may be cruel, but he would not be cruel to her and name them now. There was no easy place for him to slip back into, no more than there was for his brothers. Rob would take him. Might take him. Rob was docile as a babe now, but when the milk of the poppy wore off, he would rise from his bed as Lord of Winterfell, and deal with the wildlings that John had brought to his door. Once that was settled, would he still call him friend? But John's fate would not be decided by Robb Stark. "Aegon will always have what he wants, do not fret for him," his mother said, as though she had read his thoughts. "He has already had his fill of that, and he has been but king for a blink. Do not think the eyes of Winterfell are blind, and its ears deaf. Even here rumors reached of his disappearance with the princess on Dragonstone. Now they say the girl child that sleeps in the nursery and bears the name Stark is his own, and he means to take her south with him and name her heir. That is unjust." "Unjust, or untrue?" "Both," John said. "Robb will be wroth when he hears such lies have been allowed to grow in Winterfell. And is it a lie that Aegon loves the princess? I don't know what is in his heart. No more than he knows what lies in mine, such as it is. Daenerys can add her voice to yours. She has Aegon's ear, if not his heart. If she counsels him to free you from your vows, he will heed her." John's sword hand opened and closed, flexing the burned fingers beneath the glove. "It is not so simple, mother." Lyanna Stark was looking at him with her cold grey eyes that were so like his. "Perhaps not, but is not worth trying, for the sake of the life you may one day have. You need not ask anything of him again." "Why not this?" For all that was hard to recall, some things he could not forget, no matter how hard he tried. One such thing was the cave that would have been his tomb, and Aegon's arms, wrapped around him, pulling him from the darkness. Another was his brother's tears, as he watched over his corpse. False memories. If John was dead, how could he remember? But it felt real, real as his mother, as Winterfell's walls, as Ghost laying at his feet. Blood began to pool under his shirt, his wound opened anew, like a reminder. It was not visible beneath his black clothes now, but if he were to shed his cloak and stand naked before a lover, there would be no hiding it. What woman would lie with him? Could he father children, with his body so broken? They were thinking he could never say, not to his mother of all people, she who had brought him into the world and held such hope for him, even now. "I'll think on it." Truly. Truly. It was not a lie. There was little more that was important than that, with his black brothers growing restless, awaiting his command. Some of the tension left her then, and she squeezed his hand. "I am proud of you, John," she said. With those words he was a little boy once more, bashful and shy, trying always to please her. Something must have shown in his face, for his mother pinched his cheek, and when he protested, mussed his hair until he smiled. His dreams were foul that night. John dreamed of lost love, of Ygritte splashing in the hot pools beneath the weirwood tree in the Godswood, shedding her skins till she was naked as her name day. Except when he went to kiss her, her skin dissolved in the hot water, the flesh beneath sloughing off her bones until only skull and skeleton remained, and the pool bubbled thick and red. He woke suddenly then, and when at last he fell asleep again, it was to even worse nightmares. It was to Val, walking through the trees, as she had so long before, clad all in white, with her long braid the color of dark honey falling across her shoulder, and her cheeks flushed from the cold. John went to touch her, but she pulled away. "You betrayed me," she said, with eyes full of hate. "You sold me." "No," John protested, "I never. I only," but it was his mother who was before him, and they were in the dungeons of Winterfell, where it smelled like death. "You betrayed me, John." There was no hope in sleeping then. John dressed himself, and left his room. It could not be said that Winterfell truly slept anymore. There were too many people within its walls, too many children, too many animals, and guardsmen were always about. And many did not trust sleep. It was in the dark that the others had come before, and it was in the dark that they surely come again, if they would. But the Godswood had become a place where only brave men trod. The dragons had made it his lair, banishing away even the faithful. John's feet found him there, but not to the hot springs where Bridesen would no doubt be with her brothers. Or sisters. John could not tell the difference, and when he'd asked Sam if he'd found anything in his books about it, his friend had used too many words to tell him that he was in fact unsure. Instead, he went to the heart tree, and found another man standing before its red leaves. "My lord." The Red Viper was not the sort of man to let surprise show easily on his face, or much of anything at all. Except scorn, particularly when he's looking at me. "Lord Commander." If he was a boy, he would have made some excuse and left, or simply melted back into the trees, and hoped the Dornishmen did not notice his absence. But those days were past. Nothing held fear for him anymore, not since the cave, not since the wound, and the pyre. He stepped forward, until he was before the tree, and shoulder to shoulder with the man. "With all that has passed," the Red Viper waved his hand around, "I did not have the chance to tell you. I am sorry for your loss." "My father," John realized quickly. "Thank you, my lord. I am sorry for yours." If the rumors were true, the Red Viper's anger after the tourney of Harrenhal had been so terrible that Queen Elia has sent her brother to Essos, so he would not murder her husband. He was a poor good brother, said Oberyn Martell, and an even poorer husband. All the same, my sister mourns for him. Her heart is gentler than mine, and he was the father of her children, after all. And what a father he was, the prince sighed, as though he carried all the burdens of the world. Though you can attest to that better than most. He wants me to speak ill of my father, for his own amusement. My father was kind to me. The man watched him with those dark eyes. You were always a dutiful son. That was what Rhaegar used to tell Elia. You were better than Aegon in that. The king would have never spoken ill of his heir. The Red Viper nodded, true. He wouldn't dare say it to Elia, not in so many words, but his meaning was clear. When Aegon displeased him, when he did not take to the books as the king had, or showed little interest in the harp, or grew willful for some matter or another, Rhaegar would say how skilled Rhaenys was, or how dutiful Jon had become. That was his way, small cruelties hidden. At least when I am cruel, I make sure that it's known. As many men can attest, my lord. Old Lord Euron would among them. Aegon is not that, the Red Viper went on, as though he had not heard. He's not like Rhaegar, and gods know he is not Aerys. But he's far too spoiled, and must always get his way, and now that he's won a war he thinks it to be an easy thing. Jon's patience was wearing thin. Why are you here? This is a place of worship for those who keep the old gods. I was almost a maester. Perhaps you did not know that. He raised an eyebrow, but Jon kept his face still. In truth, I never meant to take my vows, it was only to amuse myself. But I did enjoy learning, and tonight I could not sleep, and so I thought to look upon Winterfell's heart tree. The heart trees in the south are no more than saplings in comparison. And then I chanced to see you. Perhaps the old gods meant for us to meet. He had heard enough. The old gods are not to be mocked, my lord. There is a September my uncle had built for his lady wife. Perhaps you might be better served there. I am not mocking you, Jon. Long have I wished to speak to you, but I wanted to take a measure of you first. And what is it you have found? You are dutiful, said the Red Viper, without hesitation. And more than that, you are capable. Rhaegar was ever making enemies in place of friends, and Aegon has taken after him in that. But you made allies of a people that we had taken for savages. And more than that, you made them fight for you. The free folk fight for themselves. They knew that if Winterfell fell, there would be no safe place in the world for them to return to. All the same, you won their allegiance with, where other men would have commanded them, and punished those who did not obey. So you mean to congratulate me then? The Red Viper laughed. If that pleases you, you can have my congratulations. But no. What I mean to say is you have served Robb Stark peace, and now it is his to hold, or else to ruin. But Aegon faces enemies as fierce as the wildlings, and he needs men who will advise him. Jon kept his face as still as ice. The king has his small council. Lord Connington. Connington was Rhaegar's man. And I am a man of the Night's Watch. We take no part. That black cloak can be slipped off as easily as it was slipped on. Did he dream of those words, once? When he was newly arrived at the wall, miserable and alone, did he wish someone would stand before him, and tell him he had done well, that the king had need for him, and he could consider his vows forgotten, if not fulfilled? In a different life perhaps. But not from the lips of the Red Viper. You wish to keep me and my dragon close, Jon cut to the quick. Shall I lie to you, and tell you otherwise? Prince Oberyn shrugged. I wish to keep you and your dragon close. But I would not wish to keep a fool close to my king, or a craven. He turned at last to the heart tree. Are you not tired of the cold, Jon? He was, but not in any way this man might understand. Winterfell's great hall was hazy with smoke, and thick with tension. Aegon sat on the dais, uncrowned, but it was not the crown that made the man. He wore the colors of his house and was perfectly groomed, each hair on his head perfectly placed, his beard shaved to show his youth and beauty, and while the maidens and serving girls in the hall might blush and sigh at that, the men were drawn more to what lay on the table before him. Dark Sister sat in its sheath, that fabled sword whose provenance Aegon had not deigned to explain, and in a cloak embroidered with the Targaryen dragon, 4 dragon eggs were nestled. Behind him, Sir Jaime Lannister and Sir Oswell went glittered in white, and beside him, Robb Stark sat in the seat of the old kings of winter, his hands resting on the wolves' heads carved at the end of the white stone arms. Robb was not well, though he tried to hide it. He was dressed like a lord, and spoke like a lord, but his face was pale and there was a tightness in him as he looked out over the hall with hooded eyes. Long had Robb and Jon been in talk with Aegon, the 3 men sequestered alone in the solar, and what passed between them the rest of Winterfell would now learn. It was the Dornishman who sat at the table closest to the dais. The Red Viper was chief among them, and Jon took the stocky youth at his side to be his nephew. The others Jon knew by sigil, if not by name. Manwadi, Dalt, Fowler, Lady Bright, Eula, Euronwood and Illyrian were all represented. At the table beside them sat the lords from the Crown lands and those from the Reach that Aegon had won, and Jon, who had long ago learned to notice everything, saw the king's wisdom in keeping them closer. The River Lords had been honored in their own way with a seat at the table of the Princess Daenerys and Lady Catelyn. Like Aegon, Daenerys wore no circlet on her head, but she too carried with her proof of her position. In her lap, Robb's son sat dutifully, looking every bit the little lordling. When he saw Jon enter, he waved and smiled. Jon's own place was with his black brothers. He sat in with his officers, next to his uncle Benjen, and with Iron Emmett, Bedwick, Sir Glendon Hewitt, Cotter Pike, and Denys Mallister. Samwell Tarly he sat on his other side, for he had been long in Winterfell serving under Maester Lewin. Robb's own advisers and friends and bannermen were seated on the right side of the hall. But not Bran. The Starks kept him well hidden away, as though if he were not seen, all the questions which swirled around him would be forgotten. The free folk called him Midge, but they did not fear magic. He suspected even the Northerners would have far crueler names for him. Next to them were John Arryn's Valuman, though the Lord of the Eyrie himself was yet in his sickbed. They sat between the Northmen and the free folk, and that too, John thought, was cleverly done. Among the free folk he saw Tormund, Morna White Mask, and Sigorn, and 10 other leaders, from Ygin Oldfather to Gavin the trader. Stannis Baratheon was not given a place of honor in the hall, but when the plates of food were brought out from the kitchen, he was given the first cut of the meat, a venison newly caught and freshly roasted. The Lord of Storm's End was a thin man, who seemed almost skeletal now. From the dais, Aegon proclaimed him as a hero, and the word was apt. Lord Stannis had retreated when he saw there was no chance of holding his position at the wall but not to Winterfell. He regarrisoned the Queen's Crown with his men and his provisions, and sent riders to every castle on the wall until had held it, until one reached the Rymegate, and John, and together they plotted their march to Winterfell. For every man that was here, there were 2 who had been lost. Half of Jon's black brothers were dead, and there were few lords in the hall who would not say the same. The Northmen by far had fared the poorest. Bear Island was lost for certain, and Deepwood Motte with it. So too were Last Hearth, Carhold, and the Dread Fort. Hornwood was heavily battered, but its people had survived, but Torrens Square was not so fortunate. The lands of the White Harbour, Barrowton, and Greywater Watch were unconquered but not untouched. The winter was cruel, and the castellans and lords wrote back of refugees from the south braving the neck, and freezing there. We have much and more to discuss, my lords and ladies. We have to the end of a great war to find that the world around us has changed, and new challenges await us, which we must face together. The most important of these I put before you now. Once these are settled, you may bring to me any other matters that still trouble you, Aegon said, in a voice that rose over the clamour of the hall. The first of these is the wall. Those of us who were in the north after its fall know it to be lost, and whatever power was used to raise it is lost too. I hereby declare all lands to the north to be dominion of House Stark. A great shout went out from where the free folk were seated, and John turned to see Harl the huntsman throw down his flagon of ale. Kyler joined him in cursing, and Ygin Oldfather spat at the ground, but John watched those who remained seated. Morna, Tormund, the Thans, Soren Shieldbreaker, and the Great Walrus were quiet, while Brooke leaned over to whisper something to Devin Sealskinner. It is a hard land for a hard people, and may in the end be more burden than boon. But if any can settle it, it is Northman. Aegon did not raise his voice to be heard over the clamour. Instead, the men quieted to listen. The word Northman might as well have been dragons. Though her name was not once uttered in their audience, it was on her that much of this turned. Robb would one day name lords to the Frostfangs, the Milkwater, and the Fist, poor lands that would ever remain so, but until then, it was Daenerys' dragon, its threat and its might, that would knit Robb's rule together. John glanced over at their son. Dragons were fickle creatures, and only the gods could say what might happen when Daenerys died, and Shadowtamer was without rider. Would that little boy grow into the kind of man who would face a beast such as that, whip in hand, and mount it? That would be the true boon for House Stark and for Aegon. He has 4 eggs before him. 4 dragons and 4 riders of his own. Aegon went on, together, we shall raise new lords. Some will have the blood of the first men in their veins. Others will come from distant places of Westeros, from men who stood by side with the North in its hour of need. The first of these shall be Tormund Thunderfist. There were more shouts now, and cries of outrage, but Tormund did not heed them. The Mead King of Ruddy Hall stood, cracking a gap-toothed smile. If Tormund knew how ferocious the battle between Robb and Aegon had been over him, he would have burst into laughter. But Aegon had given his word, as had John, and to betray that they would not lose only their honor, but their peace. Tormund would have risen up, there was no doubt of that, and when he did, he would raise hundreds of free folk with him. Robb spoke then, this man has served me already. It was his own daughter who brought my child south, and nursed her at her own breast, braving White Walkers and Whites to deliver her to Winterfell. If John were Lord of Winterfell, he would have gone further. The only hope for peace was to bind the free folk to the north for good, and such a tie came only through marriage, and the mingling of blood. Too many Northmen had died, and left behind widows, and sisters, and maiden daughters. Worse, whole keeps lay abandoned, their people butchered, some family trees were gone altogether, others withered down to a single, solitary branch. Daisy Mormont was the one he had thought of for Saigon, and when he had told Rob that, his cousin had looked almost startled. She would never accept a wilderling for a husband, Rob had protested, but there was no other choice for her. John tried hard to make him see that. Bear Island was a ruin, poor even in the best of times and no doubt devastated now. Saigon could help her rebuild it, and if the Ironborn ever rose again, who better than the Thans to protect the island? But Rob was not certain that Bear Island was truly lost. He must send riders first, he'd said, to each of the northern castles, to note the state of his lands and if any heirs survived still, and brooded long and deep on John's counsel. A murmur came from a bench behind him, too soft for John to hear much, save for the word bastard. He whipped his head around, thinking it was to him the insult had been directed, only to find that the heads had turned towards Daenerys, who had fire in her eyes. "Why do you hide your face behind your flagon, my lord?" she asked, directing her question at someone seated among the benches filled with northerners. "If you would insult me, have the courage to look at my face and say it." On the dais, Rob looked as though he might jump over the table. "Leave my hall," he said, in a voice cold as winter itself. A young man with bushy brown hair rose, frightened and trying to hide it. On his doublet he wore the sigil of two rusted long axes with black shafts crossed, a black crown between their points. When he was gone, the noble William Dustin rose, and bowed deeply. "Forgive me, my lord, my lady. He will be dealt with." Rob's answer was a curt nod. Iron Emmett leaned over to whisper to Denise Mallister, who sat closest to Edge, "What was that?" "That man has no honor," Sir Denise said, frowning deeply. Cotter Pike cut to the quick. He said it was the dragon's whelp that the wilderling saved. If Egon heard, he hid it well. His face and manner were unchanged, as he turned to Tormund once more. "Tormund Thunderfist, I vowed to you that you and your people would have justice for the innocents so brutally slaughtered in the Gift. And I mean to make good on my promise." Sir Jaime Lannister came forward then and placed a parchment in Egon's hands. It was the Lord of Casterly Rock's men that cut down the wilderling women who, mad with love, sought to follow their child hostages to Winterfell. Tywin Lannister has put those soldiers to question, and found that they had been bought by Mace Tyrell, to sow discord between us. I have a letter here affirming this in Lord Tywin's own hand. He lifted it before him, to show to his audience, but all John could see from where he was seated was red wax. This is madness. They had spoken of much and more, but Egon, as ever, had kept his own secrets in the end. Was this Egon's doing, or had someone planted it into his head? Was this the sort of muck that Prince Oberyn would have him deal in? The king handed it back to his Kingsguard, who moved through the room to take it to Tormund. No doubt knowing the man could not read, Sir Jaime stood over him, patiently showing him the seal, explaining the lion was the sigil of his house, and reading every word to him. It does not matter if this is true, John realized, not to Tormund, at least. Tyrell and Lannister meant nothing to him, and if he had any cunning, he would leave things as they stood. The man was more than a raider, he was a ruler, and he knew how to play the game. Tywin Lannister would have killed the soldiers to silence them, no doubt. But it did not feel like justice. This man wages war against me, and hoards the harvest for himself, while everywhere my people are starving and freezing, Egon told the free folk. I have no choice but to return south to face him in battle. I make you now this offer. Any commander who marches alongside me and serves me faithfully shall be given lands in the south, and his people shelter and sustenance. John would have had to twist his head to look at the lords from the Reach in attendance, and he would not be seen to do that now. When they marched out with Egon they knew Mace Tyrell would ever be their enemy. Which of them, John wondered, would the king raise up as the next Lord of Highgarden? Which one of their daughters would be his queen? No doubt it was that question on which all of their thoughts turned now. And what of the rest? The great Jon rose now. The man had lost his eldest son and heir, and both of his uncles, and his castle lay abandoned, his lands ravaged. It had only made him fiercer. Some might go with you, to trouble some Southroners, and that one there. He pointed to Tormund. We can stomach for the good he did our lord. But do you mean to saddle us with the lot of them? Saigon uttered a curse in the old tongue and rose up quick as a snake, with the knife he used to cut his meat in hand. The great Jon laughed when he saw that, and drew his own knife, and suddenly everyone in the hall was on their feet. Jon vaulted across the table to reach them, knowing that if blood was spilled then the peace they had worked so hard for, fragile and imperfect as it was, would go with it, and just as he reached Saigon, Rob's voice rang out from the dais. Enough. It was almost as growl, and just as fearsome as if Grey Wind were still snarling at his side. Has all the death not sated you? He looked out across the hall. If any of you wish to fight one another, do so outside Winterfell's walls, but do not think my gates will open to you again. Sit down, Saigon, Jon said. The young Magna of Then looked at him with disgust, and slammed his knife down on the table before sitting. He blames me for his father's death, Jon thought, and was bred and trained to give orders, not to take them. He had warned Aegon and Robb that something must be done about him and the 200 men that he led, but Jon worried that they had not heeded him. To answer your question, Lord Umber, Aegon went on dryly, as though there had been no interrupted. The north must be rebuilt. For that you will need men, and supplies. The coin I can give you, but the hands to raise new castles are before you. Harl the Handsome scoffed, you kill us, you starve us, and now you want to make us slaves. Slavery is an abomination which is not tolerated in the Seven Kingdoms, Aegon said. Surely you can see that you cannot return to the old way of things. We were free. Harl called out. Free to die. And now you have a choice. Ride south with me, and make your fortunes there. Serve the Lord of Winterfell faithfully, and rebuild his land. Or else take the Black. It seemed all eyes turned towards Jon then. As for him, it was to his commanders he looked. For all the boons that Aegon was granting, he had agreed to Jon's request after much argument. Their plans needed to be secret, the king had insisted, and shared with no one before they presented them before the audience, but Jon would not have his own officers caught unawares. Uncle Ben nodded, so slightly, a gesture meant only for Jon. As the king said, the wall is gone. But the watch is not. Forgive me, mother. Soren Shieldbreaker opened his mouth, but Jon went on before he could speak. Spring is at our door. But we closed our eyes before and evil grew, and took hold. The order shall be rebuilt, not to raise weapons against wildlings, but to remain vigilant to shadows shifting in the north. Castle Black shall be rebuilt. It shall serve as the center of our order. We will train our new recruits there, and send them to the households of the northern lords. Harry on Karstark spoke then. Like the Maestus, then. Alongside the Maestus, yes. Maestus are scholars, are healers in service to their lord. We are not. We are watchers. Someday, the summers may grow long once more and men will forget. It is our duty to remember. Each year, every black brother who is able shall go on a great ranging, to patrol the far corners of the north. And when holdfasts are raised there, you will find black brothers in those walls too. The coin to sustain us will come from taxes on settlements in the gift. So we are beholden to no man, and no king, he might have said. Serve, Prince Oberyn had told him, and he would, but it would not be Aegon, but his realm. All of you are here because you were strong or cunning or clever enough to survive. These are the types of men I need. Take your vows, obey, and you will have a bed, and a warm hearth, and food in your belly until the day you die. For some men, there was no other place in the world for them. And none for me. Jon's mother was right. It was another sort of life he wanted. It was Val he wanted. He wanted to steal her from her cell, take her before the heart tree and make her his wife. He wanted her to have his children, to give him a son that looked like him, as Daenerys had given Robb, and a daughter that looked like her. But that way was the path of madness, and bloodshed. When Jon returned to his seat, his officers raised their cups to him. They were good men, none of whom had paled or argued when he told them what he meant to do, but accepted it, as though it were the choice they too would have made. Our vows are for life, Benjen Stark had said solemnly, none of us have forgotten that. Aegon had a response for every question that was raised thereafter, for every petitioner that came before him. Mance Rayder, Val, and his infant son would be taken to King's Landing, he answered a Flint, where the boy and his aunt would be guests of the court, and Mance, who had given up his freedom when his people crossed the wall, would be prisoner of the Iron Throne. That had been a great boon to Robb, and the price that Aegon asked in exchange had been dear. John waited until the king made the announcement that a shipment of food was sailing up the narrow sea from Volantis now, a gift from the Queen Mother to make their friendship and renewed ties, and then it was time for every man and woman to rise, and kneel before the king to swear their oaths of allegiance. His brother's face was a mask when he knelt before him, his smile fixed. As John rose, Egon's eyes were already on the person behind him. The doors of the great hall would be opened thereafter, and those in the courtyards and hallways would be allowed to enter and feast alongside their lords and ladies. John left them, and walked through the familiar maze of Winterfell, Ghost finding him as he took the stairs the great keep, where Fat Tom stood guard. The guardsman gave him a sheepish smile, and stepped aside so John might knock on the door. "Go away. Arya, it's me." Half a moment later and the bar was shifting, and the door cracked up just enough to let him and Ghost slide through. There were tears on his cousin's cheeks, her face red, her eyes swollen. Nymeria looked similarly distressed. The wolf lay on the floor, her head on her paws, staring mournfully at John. "It's not fair." Arya cried out. "It's not. He has no right." John looked at her sadly. "Robb is Lord of Winterfell now. He'll make marriage pacts for your brothers too, one day. Bran and Rickon would wed from the north, though, Robb had told him that much, and given their own holdfasts to rule. Would a northern lord make Arya any happier? If it did, it would not be by enough. Perhaps if she had the chance to pick the man herself, but that was not often afforded to girls, and not in times such as this. She frowned. "He never even asked me. He told me I must do my duty. And my mother said she never even saw my father until the day they wed. It's only because he's dead that they are doing this." Her lip quivered. "If he was here, it would all be different." It would, John agreed. He missed his uncle too. "Tristan Martell is still young, and so are you. It will be many years until you wed." That only made Arya angrier. She wiped her tears. "Why do you all keep telling me the same things? I don't care that it will be years before I marry him. I don't care that I'll be a princess. I don't care that whether Tristan is good or brave. I don't want him. I want..." Her voice trailed off. "What do you want?" he asked, more gently. I want to go with you back to Castle Black and go on adventures beyond the wall." "Can I?" She looked at him with such hope then that it broke his heart. "No, Arya. I'm sorry." She must have already known, but she looked devastated all the same. For a long moment, she was quiet. "I'll never marry him." It was not a whisper, a secret. It was bold, as she was. It was not for him to convince her. There would be enough of that, in the days and years to come. But soon the snows would thaw and he would leave, and perhaps he would never see her again. "Come on," he reached his hand out to her. Arya looked at it suspiciously. "I won't go to the feast." "We're not going to the feast." "Then where are we going?" "To the Godswood." She crossed her arms over her chest. "Why? Have you ever ridden a dragon?" Notes. My apologies for taking down the chapter and reposting it. I don't think I've ever done that in the past, but I was reflecting on some of the decisions I made in this chapter and wasn't quite happy with them. They didn't quite fit in with the final vision I have for this words. As always, I'm incredibly grateful for your comments. They really helped me to begin thinking more critically and more imaginatively, and I really appreciate you all. In addition to changes to the Night's Watch, I added a conversation with Oberyn as someone pointed out that I had all these great characters but they weren't interacting with each other. I was intrigued by setting this up as sort of the last temptation of Christ, with these conversations with Lyanna and Oberyn, one person who is incredibly important to Jon, the other who exists as sort of a figure of so many things that haunt him, and their very differing visions for his future, as contrasted with his final decision. Chapter 60, Bran 7. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Bran looked up at the dread fort uncertainly. Its northern walls had been recently rebuilt, and only here did the builders omit the melons that lined the rest, like sharp teeth. It was no less welcoming within. All around the great hall were rows of torches, grasped by skeletal hands jutting from the walls, as though ghosts, long trapped, were trying to break free. It was only his imagination, but he wanted them knocked down all the same. Rob said he could. It would be his castle after all, but he told him to study the cost, and think on what was best to set the builders to do next. The dungeons, Bran decided. When Rob first rode to the Bolton lands, it had been at the start of spring with 50 riders, so unsure he was of what he would find there. His brother had decreed that he was too young to join him then, and when he'd returned, he spoke only of the repairs that must be made. It was recently that Rob had told him the true story, of the room which lay behind 2 doors, unlocked with keys they had found in the Lord of the Dreadfort's chambers, that contained nothing but flayed, human skins. The dungeons below the Dreadfort were worse. There were corpses of women tied to the walls with chains, skin pulled up in places as though their torture had been interrupted, preserved by the cold. Rob had it all burned, the corpses and the skins, but when Bran saw the rooms for himself, he had felt goose pimples rise on his skin. "It's even worse than old Nan's stories," he mumbled. She had died a year ago, and they had all grieved bitterly for her, but she had stopped telling her tales long before that. Rob heard him. His brother sat straight atop his big grey and white gelding in the shadow of the walls. "If tales of what has been done here reached Winterfell, father would have brought down his justice on Roose Bolton's head. But they're all gone, father, and Lord Roose, and whoever else had a hand in this. I'll be good lord. I'll protect my people," Bran said, determined. He was 16 now, and understood what that meant. "I know you will. You may rename the castle, if you wish. You're to start a new house, a new name should mark that. I'll wait for Wyler." Rob raised an eyebrow at that. "If she's going to be my lady, it's only right she gets to choose too." Rob smiled. "Who says only Southroners know chivalry?" He pulled the reins up. "Come on, I'll race you to the hills." They kicked their horses forward, and galloped off, with Bran's wolf and Rob's men-at-arms following behind. Spring was turning into summer, and it had been weeks since it last snowed. It made for easy riding, and quickly they reached the trail that would take them up through the Sheep's Head Hills to cross the White Knife and return to Winterfell. A green grass was upon the ground, with red wildflowers dotting here and there, though on their path they were mostly trodden underfoot from the passage of horses and man. Bran took that for a good sign. If he wanted to, he could see it as it was a few short years ago, when the grass was all dead and buried beneath frost, and the snow drifts had fallen so high that they reached halfway up the watchtowers which they now neared. But Bran didn't often think of those days. When they came upon the edge of the first small farm, they stopped. Bran had won. "Well done," Rob called out to him, but he was already putting on the face of the Lord of Winterfell. The grazing area was bordered with rings of stone, and a man not much older than them stood near a field of hay. He ran over when he saw the men on their horses, with the banners of the Starks of Winterfell flapping overhead, and the dire wolf that accompanied them. Rob and Bran left their horses with Jory then, and went to speak to him. His name was Hal, and he wasn't a northerner at all. He had been an innkeeper near Maidenpool, he said, and come north when spring came, and Rob's riders were sent out to say that the Lord of Winterfell was welcoming able men and women, who could live on his lands peacefully and were strong enough to harvest it. The man was one of the fortunate ones, Bran thought. He has come early, and his farm was built cleverly into the hills so that it was leveled with even the highest area, too steep for farming, used for grazing. The refugees who had come later, fleeing the battles in the Reach, would never have plots such as this, with homes built of strong stone and tufted with chimney smoke, as Hal had built. For every carpenter and bricklayer, there were hundreds more without neither skill nor trade, and they were destined to become stable hands, or scullions, or field hands. The North needed all of those things too, or so Rob said, but not near as much. It would be another year before the Dreadfort was ready, and even longer before Deepwood Motte could house people once more. Galbart Glover and Robert Glover were all gone, but Robert's lady wife Sybil had fled with her children when the Whites had come, and the castle fell. Her son had died somewhere in the Wolf's Wood, but she and her daughter had lived, and when the snow melted away, she sent a rider to Winterfell from the village on the stony shore where they had hidden away with what remained of her people. Rickon would marry that little girl one day, and become Lord of Deepwood. Rob wanted to build a great harbour there, one day, and raise a galley of ships, and though their little brother was only 11 still, he had gone on for months afterwards about his plans to sail the Sunset Sea. But those were all dreams, dreams which needed coin, and of which Winterfell had too little. The only lords with dragons in the realm, Bran often heard quipped, were Tywin Lannister and Aegon Targaryen. The rest had too many harvests go to waste, or else spent their money on war-making, while the king had replenished the royal treasury with the wealth of Highgarden, and the gold veins of Casterly Rock did not wither and freeze as did oat and barley. Some of that coin had gone to Carstark and Umber, to fortify their castles, and some to Castle Black, but Robb complained to him after councils that the king was miserly when it suited him. He wanted the north to recover so he may have his taxes, Robb explained, but not enough that they might become a rival to the Iron Throne. If that day ever came, it would not come for centuries. Out loud, Robb had wondered more than once that if the Lord of Winterfell could hardly rebuild his existing castles, how could he raise new keeps at the foothills of the Frostfangs, or upon the frozen shore, or resettle Hardham? The rest of their journey was faster going, for Robb had been through here less than a year past, and the lands were well settled for their proximity to Hornwood and Winterfell both. Those who had come up from the south preferred to live in the shadow of a lord's walls, wary of the lands north of Winterfell, which were sparsely populated yet. The Wolfswood they feared most of all, for Daenerys' dragon had made its lair there among the trees. In fact, they feared the dragon more than the wildlings. To them, every northerner was a wilderling and every wilderling a northerner. They slept in the old watchtowers, half still unmanned, the last of which was under command of the wilderling mourner, who wore a white weirwood mask. Robb spoke to her for hours, but all the while it seemed to Bran that she was watching him. Her gaze made him feel naked. He told his brother, as they rode away. "I saw that too, Bran. Her and her people live under the shadow of Hornwood, Winterfell, and the Dread Fort. She was taking a measure of you." Bran shook his head. "She thinks I'm a midge. Or worse. A beast, a monster, like he'd always feared." He had thought that stopped mattering to him long ago and that a man grown wouldn't care. Robb never seemed to be daunted by anything, or anyone. "And if she does? It's good that the wildlings should fear us a little." Bran didn't want to be feared, but Hullen had pulled up his horse alongside Robb, and his brother was laughing at some jape he had made. It was a clear day when they arrived to Winterfell, with a brisk wind swirling that left their cheeks reddened. Atop the walls, men called out Stark and Winterfell, as they rode through the east gate to find Alara waiting for them. Robb handed his reins to Hullen, and scooped his daughter into his arms. She had silver curls that were ever falling in her eyes. It gave her a mischievous look, though she was gentle and sweet, and always did as she was told. Robb's youngest daughter was quite the opposite. Sura was 2 years old, with auburn hair, large purple eyes, and skin the color of porcelain. But she was headstrong already, and Robb often said that she only listened to what she wished to hear, and ignored the rest. "Hello, Uncle Bran," she said, when he went to them. "Hello, Summer. Hello, Lara. I missed you." "I missed you too," she repeated, dutifully, though it was her father she truly wanted. Bran left them there. His mother was not in her room, nor in the Great Hall or the Solar, but he did find Rickon, always where he shouldn't be, sneaking cakes from the kitchen. Gage shooed them away, though not before giving Bran his own piece to try. His little brother led him to their mother, who had been in Arya's room all along. Inside was a chaos of strewn clothing spilling out of chests, and garlands of flowers strung across the bed, and pieces of gold jewelry laid out across a table. At the center of it was Arya, looking angry and sad all at once, dressed in a gown of ivory and grey, with sleeves that hung almost to the ground, and skirt so full Nymeria could hide under it. Their mother knelt over the train, sewing something into the fabric, and entreating Arya to hold very still. Rickon giggled. "You look pretty." Bran finished it for him. He supposed she did, at least that's what people often said of Arya now. Her hair was wild as ever, though, and it did make her look a little funny. Arya looked so upset it was though Rickon had said the words that were on his tongue. But their mother looked up, smiling, and Bran went to embrace her. She touched his cheek. "How was the journey? How is Robb?" "It went well." "We..." Arya interrupted. "Are we finished?" "No, we are not," his mother said firmly, but only Bran could see the smile on her face. "The sooner you hold still, the sooner I'll be done." "The dress really is pretty," Bran said. "And I like the flowers." Arya scowled. "What do you know about flowers?" "I know loads about flowers," Rickon teased, grinning. "They are so pretty. Just like you, Arya." She would have lunged at him then, had their mother not intervened, and told them to find something else to occupy themselves. Once Bran was in the hallway, he scolded his brother. "You shouldn't tease her." "Why not?" "She teases me all the time." "Because soon she'll be wed." His brother was tall and slender, and as wild as he was when he was a boy. "So?" Arya's frightened. She hadn't told him as much, but he could tell all the same. "She's going so far away." Rickon shrugged. "She's never frightened of anything. This isn't like other things." "Well, you're getting married too." "It's not the same. It's different for girls." "Why?" "I'm not sure," Bran admitted. "But mother said so." To his credit, Rickon at least seemed to think it over. "It doesn't matter anyway. She's not going to get married at all, in the end." "What do you mean?" "It's Arya," his brother said. "The morning of her wedding, they'll go fetch her and they'll find her gone. And by then it'll be too late." Bran looked at his brother suspiciously. "Did she tell you that?" "No. But watch, you'll see." Bran hoped not. He would believe as much of his sister, but she was older now, and if he could understand what her marriage meant to Robb and to the North, she could too. "She won't. Just be kind to her is all." Neither he nor his brother had much chance to be kind, or cruel, in the days that followed. Arya seemed always to be behind closed doors, surrounded by women, and guests were arriving to Winterfell each day. The first were those from the castles closest to Winterfell, from Hornwood and Sewin and the Barrowlands. The Great Jon had come all the way from Last Hearth, and with him travelled guests from the mountain clans, and Bran's own sister Sansa, who came with Harry and their son, a little boy they'd named Torrhen for one of his brothers. Torrhen looked like a Karstark, but his manners were all Sansa. He spoke like a little lord already, though he was only 3. Bran's own betrothed arrived on a cold, crisp day ahead of her grandfather's van and his retainers. When she rode into the courtyard, Wyler Marndale greeted him with a wave and smile. He liked Wyler very much, and he thought one day he could love her, once they were wed. She was closer to Robb's age, but the difference mattered less and less as he grew older, and if she ever took him to be a little boy, she never showed it. It had been different with Moira. The thought of her after all these years still made him feel sad, and guilty now that he was promised to another. She knew him better than anyone, better even than Robb, but everything between them was darkened by Hojan's death. She had married Owen Norrie, and would one day be Lady of Greywater Watch, and though for a while they wrote each other letters, it had been a year at least since the last one. His letters to Wyler were stilted, and awkward, but it was always easier to think of things to say when they were together. She was brave, he'd learned, and bold, and he'd come to like her green braid that was sometimes the color of emeralds and other times dried seaweed. When they walked in the Godswood, he told her about Arya. "Perhaps Prince Tristan is like his uncle," she had suggested, as she scratched Summer behind the ears. "The Red Viper has natural daughters all over Dorne and he poisons his enemies." Bran had met Oberyn Martell long ago, but the man hadn't taken much interest in him. He shrugged. "Perhaps. But my mother met him when she and Arya traveled to Sunspear. She says he's noble and good. I hope that he is. I hope your sister finds happiness in her marriage, for all of our sakes." They walked a while without speaking, until they reached the heart tree and the black pond beneath it. The Marndales kept the new gods, but she seemed to grow more somber before it all the same. "I could still be a knight if I wanted to," he thought, "just like her kin. Perhaps it would even please her if he took his knighthood from her father, or her grandfather. Perhaps it might even please his mother." But Bran had come to see that those dreams belonged to a different time. "What about you?" he asked her. "What about me? Are you frightened?" Wyler laughed, not unkindly. "Of what?" "Of being wed." Wyler shook her head, and her braid. "No," Wyler seemed to think on that. "But perhaps if you were a Dornishman who I hardly knew, I would be." She didn't ask Bran if he was scared. The Dornishmen did not come alone. The streaming banners made for a pretty sight, as did that of their riders, dressed richly and traveling on the most beautiful horses Bran had seen. Some of them looked familiar, veterans of the war in Winterfell, but others were new to him, including the ladies. Bran wondered what they would make of the Stark stronghold. The first keep, damaged in the battle, had been torn down, and nothing had been raised in its place since. And their lands had been untouched. His family lined up in the courtyard to greet them. Robb was first, with Cregan at his side. The heir to Winterfell was 7 and everyone agreed that he was clever, and he could be charming when he tried, but he was a quiet boy, who seemed to be happiest in his own company. Daenerys held Alara by the hand, half shy, half curious, and with the other balanced Sora on her hip, already fussing to be let down. His mother was next, with Arya beside her, wearing the same dress Bran had seen her try in her room. Sansa